In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away, leaving Whiskers content and purring in the sun. The morning mist rises from the great lake surrounding Tenochtitlan as you make your way through the floating gardens toward the palace complex where your destiny awaits. The year is 1519, and you are Itzel, a young woman who has spent the last 8 years learning the most sacred and dangerous craft in all the Aztec Empire, the preparation of chocolate, the divine drink of the gods. Your bare feet make soft sounds on the stone causeway as you carry your precious cargo. A clay vessel contained the finest cacao beans from the southern provinces, each one inspected, blessed, and prepared according to rituals that stretch back to the dawn of time. These aren't ordinary beans. According to Aztec belief, they are fragments of the heart of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who gave this gift to humanity at the cost of his own divine essence. The weight of this responsibility presses down on you like the humid air that clings to the lake. You are one of only 12 certified chocolate makers in the entire empire, chosen not just for your skill, but for your spiritual purity, your dedication to the gods, and your absolute discretion. The recipes you know, the techniques you've mastered, the sacred proportions you've memorized. These are state secrets that could shift the balance of power between empires if they fell into the wrong hands. As you approach the palace gates, you pause to touch the small jade amulet that hangs around your neck, a symbol of Ixcacao, the goddess of chocolate, who watches over all who work with her sacred beans. The guards recognize you immediately, stepping aside with the mixture of respect and wariness that all palace servants show toward those who work directly with divine substances. The palace complex of Tenochtitlan is like nothing else in the world, a sprawling network of stone buildings, gardens and courtyards that house not just the emperor and his family, but an entire civilization's worth of craftsmen, priests, administrators, and servants. The architecture is both beautiful and intimidating, with towering pyramids, intricate carvings, and gardens that seem to float on the surface of the lake. Your workshop is located in the most secure section of the palace, near the emperor's private quarters and the temples where the most important religious ceremonies take place. The room itself is modest but perfectly equipped. Stone grinding platforms, ceramic vessels of various sizes, wooden stirring implements carved with sacred symbols, and storage areas for the dozens of ingredients that go into the various chocolate preparations you're required to master. But it's not just the physical space that makes this work sacred. It's the knowledge that you carry, passed down through generations of chocolate makers who served the rulers of this empire. You know the difference between ceremonial chocolate and daily drinking chocolate. You understand which spices enhance the divine properties of cacao and which ones are reserved for specific rituals. You can prepare chocolate that energizes warriors before battle, chocolate that aids priests in their visions, and chocolate that allows the emperor himself to commune with the gods. This knowledge came at a price. For 8 years, you studied under Master Necali, an elderly chocolate maker whose reputation extended throughout the empire. He taught you not just the technical aspects of chocolate preparation, but the spiritual discipline required to handle substances that the gods themselves had blessed. Every morning began with prayers and purification rituals. Every recipe required precise attention to astronomical alignments and religious calendar dates. Every batch of chocolate was prepared with the understanding that you were participating in a sacred act that connected the earthly and divine realms. Remember, Master Necali would tell you as you practiced grinding cacao beans, chocolate is not food. It is medicine for the soul, nourishment for the spirit, and a bridge between our world and the realm of the gods. When you prepare it carelessly, you offend the divine order. When you prepare it perfectly, You become a vessel for the god's will. The training was rigorous and sometimes dangerous. Some of the ingredients used in ceremonial chocolate preparations were mildly toxic if not handled properly. Others had powerful psychoactive properties that could affect your mental state if you weren't careful about exposure. You learned to work with plants and substances that could heal or harm, depending on dosage and preparation methods. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of your training was learning to maintain the secrecy that surrounded your craft. Chocolate making wasn't just a trade. It was a state monopoly controlled by the emperor and his priests. The specific recipes, the sources of the finest ingredients, the techniques for achieving perfect texture and flavor, all of this information was considered too valuable to allow unrestricted access. Your first task each day is preparing the emperor's morning chocolate, a responsibility that carries both tremendous honor and terrifying risk. Moctezuma II, ruler of the Aztec Empire, begins each day with a specially prepared chocolate drink. That's designed to give him the strength and wisdom needed to govern millions of people across a territory that stretches from sea to sea. The Emperor's chocolate isn't the sweet confection that you might imagine. It's a complex, bitter beverage that combines cacao with chili peppers, vanilla, honey, and a dozen other ingredients that must be balanced with mathematical precision. Too much chili and the drink becomes unpalatable. Too little vanilla, and it lacks the aromatic complexity that the Emperor expects. Even small variations in the grinding of the cacao beans can affect the final texture in ways that displease the imperial palate. You begin the preparation before dawn, working by the light of oil lamps in your workshop while the palace still sleeps around you. The process starts with selecting the cacao beans. Not just any beans, but specific ones that have been chosen for their size, color, and spiritual potency. Each bean must be individually inspected, cleaned, and blessed before it can be used in the Emperor's drink. The roasting process requires precise timing and temperature control that you judge entirely by sound, smell, and experience. Too little roasting and the beans won't develop their full flavor. Too much, and they become bitter in ways that can't be corrected with other ingredients. You've spent years learning to recognize the subtle changes in aroma that indicate when the beans have reached perfect roasting. After roasting comes grinding, a process that can take hours depending on the quantity of chocolate being prepared. The stone grinding platform, called a metate, is itself a sacred object that's been blessed by priests and consecrated for chocolate preparation. The grinding stone, carved from volcanic rock, imparts subtle mineral flavors to the chocolate while creating the smooth, fine texture that's essential for proper mixing. The grinding is physically demanding work that requires both strength and finesse. You must maintain consistent pressure and rhythm while gradually adding small amounts of water or other liquids to achieve the proper consistency. The motion is meditative, almost hypnotic, and many chocolate makers report experiencing visions or spiritual insights during long grinding sessions. As you work, you recite the prayers and incantations that Master Nakali taught you, words in the ancient language that invoke the protection of cacao and request her blessing on the chocolate you're preparing. These aren't just traditional formulas. They're believed to have actual spiritual power that affects the quality and potency of the finished product. The Emperor's morning chocolate also requires a precise blend of spices and aromatics that vary according to the season, the phase of the moon, and important events in the imperial calendar. During times of war, the blend includes more aggressive spices like black pepper and dried chilies that are thought to enhance martial vigor. During religious festivals, it includes copal resin and other substances associated with spiritual purification. The final stage of preparation involves the most delicate and crucial technique in chocolate making, the creation of foam. Aztec chocolate is traditionally served with a thick layer of foam on top, created by pouring the liquid back and forth between vessels from increasing heights until the perfect texture is achieved. This isn't just aesthetic. The foam is believed to contain the spiritual essence of the chocolate in concentrated form. When the Emperor's chocolate is ready, you must taste it yourself before it can be served, not just to ensure quality, but to demonstrate that it hasn't been poisoned. This is both an honor and a risk, since even minor imperfections in the chocolate can result in severe punishment. You've heard stories of chocolate makers who were executed for preparing drinks that failed to meet imperial standards. The moment of serving is always tense. You enter the Emperor's private chambers carrying the chocolate in a specially designed golden cup, accompanied by guards and witnessed by court officials, who are responsible for monitoring every aspect of the imperial routine. Moctezuma examines the chocolate carefully, checking the color, inhaling the aroma, and evaluating the quality of the foam before taking his first sip. His reaction determines not just the success of your work, but potentially your continued survival. A pleased emperor might reward you with additional privileges or valuable gifts. A displeased emperor has been known to order immediate execution for servants who fail to meet his expectations. You stand silently, watching his face for any sign of approval or disapproval, knowing that your life hangs in the balance of his judgment. The art of chocolate making extends far beyond simply processing cacao beans. Your workshop contains dozens of ingredients, each with its own spiritual significance, medicinal properties, and specific applications in different types of chocolate. Preparations, understanding these ingredients, their origins, their effects, their proper proportions, represents years of study that goes far beyond simple cooking techniques. Cacao beans themselves come from several different regions of the empire, each producing beans with distinct characteristics that affect both flavor and spiritual potency. The most prized beans come from the Soconusco region along the Pacific coast, where the climate and soil conditions produce large, oily beans with complex flavors and powerful psychoactive properties. These beans are reserved exclusively for imperial use and the most important religious ceremonies. Beans from the Tabasco region are smaller but more intense, with a natural bitterness that pairs well with honey and vanilla in preparations designed for warriors and priests. Highland beans from the Guatemalan provinces have subtle floral notes that make them ideal for everyday drinking, chocolate, and diplomatic gifts to foreign dignitaries. But cacao is just the foundation. The real complexity of Aztec chocolate comes from the dozens of other ingredients that can be combined in different proportions to create drinks for specific purposes. Chili peppers are perhaps the most important addition, but not all chilies are the same. You work with everything from mild, sweet peppers that add warmth without heat, to fiery varieties that can literally bring tears to the eyes of those who drink them. Vanilla, which grows wild in the humid forests of the eastern provinces, adds aromatic complexity that the Aztecs associate with spiritual elevation and divine connection. The vanilla pods must be harvested at exactly the right stage of ripeness and cured using techniques that can take months to complete properly. A single batch of imperial chocolate might require vanilla that's been aging for over a year. Honey, commies from sacred bees that are tended by specialized beekeepers who follow religious protocols, designed to maintain the spiritual purity of their product. Different types of honey from different flowers, collected during different seasons, have distinct flavors and supposed effects on consciousness and spiritual awareness. Allspice, known to the Aztecs as the divine berry, grows in the southern forests and is believed to have powerful protective properties. Chocolate prepared with allspice is traditionally consumed before important battles or dangerous journeys, as it's thought to shield the drinker from harm and provide supernatural courage. Achiote, the seeds of the annatto tree, provides both color and flavor to ceremonial chocolate preparations. The bright red pigment is associated with blood sacrifice and divine power. making achiote-enhanced chocolate appropriate for the most solemn religious ceremonies. The seeds must be ground fresh for each use, as their potency diminishes rapidly once they're exposed to air. More exotic ingredients include dried flowers that bloom only during specific astronomical events, tree barks that must be harvested during new moons, and minerals ground from sacred stones found in particular mountain caves. Each of these specialty ingredients requires specific knowledge about procurement, storage, and preparation that's closely guarded by the chocolate-making guild. Some ingredients are mildly psychoactive, producing subtle changes in consciousness that enhance the spiritual aspects of chocolate consumption. Others have medicinal properties that address specific health concerns. Still others are purely ceremonial, included not for their physical effects, but for their symbolic significance in religious contexts. The proportions and combinations of these ingredients are where the real artistry of chocolate making lies. A preparation that's intended to enhance battlefield courage requires a completely different balance than one designed for religious visions. Chocolate for diplomatic ceremonies must have different qualities than chocolate prepared for private meditation. You've memorized hundreds of different recipes, each coded to specific purposes, occasions, and intended effects. Some are written down in sacred books that are kept under heavy guard in the palace archives. Others exist only in the memories of master chocolate makers, passed down through oral tradition that stretches back generations. The procurement of ingredients is itself a complex operation that involves traders, tribute collectors, and specialized gatherers who travel throughout the empire seeking the finest materials. The emperor's chocolate makers have priority access to the best ingredients, but even they must sometimes wait months for specific items that are only available during certain seasons or from particular sources. Storage and preservation of ingredients requires constant attention to humidity, temperature, and spiritual purity. Many ingredients lose their potency if exposed to sunlight or contaminated by contact with profane substances. Others must be ritually cleansed or blessed at regular intervals to maintain their sacred properties. Your expertise encompasses not just one type of chocolate, but dozens of different preparations, each designed for specific purposes and occasions. Within Aztec society, understanding these variations, their ingredients, their intended effects, their appropriate contexts, represents one of the most complex aspects of your training as a master chocolate maker. The Emperor's daily chocolate, which you prepare each morning, is just one of many formulations that you must master. Imperial ceremonial chocolate, used during the most important state occasions, includes rare ingredients that are reserved exclusively for the ruler and his immediate family. This preparation takes days to complete properly, as many of its components require individual preparation, purification, and blessing by priests before they can be combined. Warrior chocolate is formulated to provide sustained energy and heightened alertness during military campaigns. It includes stimulating herbs and spices that can maintain fighting effectiveness for hours, along with ingredients believed to enhance courage and reduce sensitivity to pain. The preparation is intentionally bitter and challenging to drink, reflecting the harsh realities of warfare that it's designed to support. Priest chocolate aids religious practitioners in achieving the altered states of consciousness necessary for divination, prophecy, and communication with the divine realm. These preparations often include mildly psychoactive plants that must be handled with extreme care, as improper dosages can cause serious illness or even death. Only the most experienced chocolate makers are trusted with these recipes. Diplomatic chocolate, served to foreign ambassadors and visiting dignitaries, is designed to demonstrate the sophistication and power of Aztec civilization. These preparations emphasize complex flavors and aromatic qualities that showcase the empire's access to rare ingredients from across Mesoamerica. The presentation is as important as the taste. with elaborate serving vessels and ceremonial protocols that reinforce political messages. Healing chocolate incorporates medicinal plants and minerals that address specific health conditions. Different formulations exist for digestive problems, respiratory ailments, fertility issues, and mental disturbances. These preparations blur the line between food and medicine, requiring knowledge of both culinary techniques and therapeutic applications. Funeral chocolate is prepared for religious ceremonies honoring the dead and facilitating their journey to the afterlife. These somber preparations include ingredients associated with death and rebirth, often incorporating symbolic elements like black beans or ash from sacred fires. The flavor is intentionally austere, reflecting the gravity of the occasions where it's consumed. Harvest chocolate celebrates the agricultural cycles that sustain Aztec civilization. Different preparations mark the planting season, the growing period, and the harvest itself. These chocolates often incorporate ingredients that are fresh and seasonal, connecting the drinker to the natural rhythms that govern all life. Coming-of-age chocolate marks important transitions in the lives of young Aztecs, particularly those entering adulthood or beginning specialized training. These preparations are designed to symbolically transform the drinker, facilitating psychological and spiritual development through carefully chosen ingredients and ritual consumption. Trading chocolate serves as both currency and diplomatic tool in commercial relationships with other civilizations. These preparations must be stable enough to survive long journeys while maintaining flavors that appeal to foreign palates. The recipes often represent compromises between Aztec preferences and the tastes of distant trading partners. Festival. Chocolate celebrates the many religious holidays that punctuate the Aztec calendar. Each major festival has its own traditional chocolate preparation, often incorporating seasonal ingredients and symbolic elements that relate to the specific deities or natural forces being honored. Women's chocolate addresses the particular health and spiritual needs of female members of Aztec society. These preparations often include herbs that support reproductive health, ease childbirth, or facilitate the spiritual roles that women play in religious ceremonies. The recipes are closely guarded by female chocolate makers and passed down through maternal lineages. Children's chocolate introduces young Aztecs to the sacred nature of cacao, while providing gentler preparations that are appropriate for developing palates and smaller bodies. These formulations typically emphasize sweetness and mild flavors, though they still maintain the spiritual significance that characterizes all chocolate consumption in Aztec culture. Each type of chocolate requires not just different ingredients and proportions, but different preparation techniques, serving methods, and consumption protocols. The grinding might be finer or coarser, depending on the intended use. The foaming technique might vary to achieve different textures. The temperature of serving might be adjusted based on the spiritual or medicinal effects desired. Working as a chocolate maker in the Aztec Empire brings not just honor and privilege, but serious risks that can threaten your health, your freedom, and even your life. The knowledge you possess, the substances you handle, and the people you serve all present dangers that require constant vigilance and careful navigation of complex political and spiritual landscapes. The most immediate danger comes from the ingredients themselves. Many of the plants and substances used in chocolate preparation are toxic in large doses or if prepared incorrectly. The chili peppers that add heat to warrior chocolate can cause severe burns if handled carelessly. The psychoactive herbs used in priest chocolate can produce dangerous reactions if accidentally consumed in pure form or mixed in wrong proportions. You've learned to work with these hazardous materials through years of careful training, but accidents still happen. Other chocolate makers have suffered permanent injury from exposure to caustic plant extracts, respiratory damage from inhaling certain powdered ingredients, and neurological effects from accidental ingestion of psychoactive substances. The workshop contains antidotes and treatments for common poisonings, but some exposures can cause irreversible harm. The political dangers are perhaps even more serious. As someone who has daily access to the Emperor and detailed knowledge of his routines, you're automatically suspected of potential involvement in any assassination attempts or palace conspiracies. The Imperial Guard maintains constant surveillance of all chocolate makers, looking for signs of disloyalty, suspicious contacts, or unusual behavior that might indicate treasonous intentions. The recipes and techniques you've mastered are considered state secrets whose unauthorized disclosure could be punishable by death. Foreign powers would pay enormous sums for detailed information about Aztec chocolate preparation, particularly the formulations used for military and ceremonial purposes. You must be constantly aware of who might be trying to extract information from you and take precautions to protect sensitive knowledge. Your position also makes you a target for factional politics within the palace. Different noble families and religious groups compete for influence over the emperor, and they sometimes attempt to recruit or coerce chocolate makers to serve their interests. Refusing such advances can be dangerous, but accepting them can be even more perilous if you choose. The wrong side in imperial power struggles. The spiritual aspects of your work create additional hazards. Aztec religion involves powerful supernatural forces that are believed to directly affect the physical world. If your chocolate preparations fail to maintain proper spiritual protocols, you risk not just imperial displeasure, but divine retribution. That could manifest as illness, accidents, or other forms of supernatural punishment. The secrecy surrounding your craft also creates psychological pressures that can be difficult to manage. You cannot discuss your work with family members or friends outside the palace. You cannot seek advice or support when facing difficult technical or ethical challenges. The isolation and stress of maintaining absolute discretion while performing demanding work under constant scrutiny takes a toll on mental health that many chocolate makers struggle to manage. Economic pressures add another layer of risk. Your position depends entirely on imperial favor, which can be withdrawn without warning or explanation. Chocolate makers who fall from grace often find themselves unemployable in other trades, as their specialized knowledge is useless outside. The palace context and their association with imperial service makes them suspect to potential employers. The physical demands of chocolate preparation can also cause long-term health problems. Hours of grinding cacao beans create repetitive stress injuries that can permanently damage hands and arms. Constant exposure to smoke from roasting operations affects respiratory health. The bent posture required for much of the work causes back and neck problems that worsen with age. Some of the ingredients used in chocolate preparation have cumulative, toxic effects that only become apparent after years of exposure. Lead-based pigments used in ceremonial preparations can cause neurological damage. Certain plant alkaloids can accumulate in body tissues and eventually reach dangerous levels. Mercury compounds used in some medicinal chocolates can cause progressive poisoning that's difficult to detect until serious damage has occurred. The competitive atmosphere among chocolate makers creates additional stress and potential dangers. Imperial favor is limited, and advancement opportunities are rare. Chocolate makers sometimes attempt to sabotage rivals by contaminating their ingredients, spreading rumors about their loyalty, or attempting to steal their recipes. These internal conflicts can escalate into serious confrontations that threaten everyone involved. Natural disasters pose special risks for chocolate makers because of their dependence on specific ingredients and precise working conditions. Earthquakes can destroy carefully maintained supplies of rare materials. Floods can contaminate grinding equipment and storage areas. Volcanic eruptions can disrupt trade routes that supply essential ingredients from distant provinces. Your role as a master chocolate maker extends far beyond daily food preparation into the most sacred and politically significant ceremonies of Aztec religious and state life. These elaborate rituals, some lasting for days, require chocolate preparations that are both technically complex and spiritually profound, connecting the earthly realm to the divine powers that govern the universe. The most important of these ceremonies is the annual festival of Quetzal, the goddess of love, beauty, and chocolate, which takes place during the height of the cacao harvest season. Your preparations for this festival begin months in advance, as many of the required ingredients are available only during specific times of year and must be processed according to astronomical calculations that determine their maximum spiritual potency. The festival chocolate for Quetzal requires cacao beans that have been blessed by virgin priestesses during the new moon preceding the ceremony. These beans must be ground using metates that have been consecrated specifically for goddess worship and have never been used for any secular purpose. The grinding itself becomes a form of prayer, with specific rhythms and incantations that must be maintained throughout the process. The preparation includes flowers from the sacred chocolate, tree that blooms only once per year, vanilla pods that have been aged in temple storage chambers, and honey collected by bees that have fed exclusively on cacao blossoms. Each ingredient must be added at specific times that correspond to the movement of Venus across the sky, as this planet is considered the earthly manifestation of Quetzal's divine essence. The ceremony itself involves elaborate presentations, where chocolate is offered to massive stone statues of the goddess, while priests chant prayers that have been passed down for generations. The emperor and his highest nobles consume the sacred chocolate in carefully orchestrated rituals that symbolically unite them with divine power while demonstrating their spiritual authority over the empire. Military ceremonies require different but equally complex chocolate preparations. Before major battles, warriors participate in rituals designed to invoke the protection of Huitzilopochtli, the god of war and the sun. The chocolate prepared for these ceremonies includes blood from recently sacrificed enemies, chili peppers so hot they can cause temporary blindness, and herbs that are believed to make warriors immune to fear and pain. The preparation of military chocolate is physically demanding and emotionally challenging. The ingredients must be ground while war drums beat continuously in the background, creating a hypnotic rhythm that's supposed to align the chocolate's spiritual properties with the aggressive energy needed for successful warfare. The process often continues through the night, with chocolate makers working in shifts to maintain the required intensity. Diplomatic ceremonies use chocolate as both gift and demonstration of imperial power. When foreign ambassadors visit Tenochtitlan, they're served elaborate chocolate preparations that showcase the empire's wealth, sophistication, and access to rare materials from across Mesoamerica. These presentations are carefully choreographed to send specific political messages about Aztec capabilities and intentions. The diplomatic chocolates you prepare for these occasions must be both impressive and palatable to foreign tastes that may be unfamiliar with traditional Aztec preparations. This requires adjusting standard recipes to reduce bitterness while maintaining the complex flavors that demonstrate your expertise. The presentations often include chocolate sculptures, flavored foams, and multi-course chocolate tastings that can last for hours. Religious ceremonies marking important calendar events require chocolates that connect participants to cosmic cycles and divine interventions in earthly affairs. The Aztec calendar includes dozens of festivals honoring different deities, natural forces, and astronomical events, each requiring specialized chocolate preparations that reflect the specific spiritual themes being celebrated. The ceremony of Tenochtitlan, which honors the god Tezcatlipoca, requires chocolate prepared with obsidian dust and volcanic ash, substances that connect the preparation to the Earth's destructive and creative powers. The chocolate is intentionally harsh and challenging to drink, reflecting the demanding nature of this particular deity and the serious spiritual commitments required of his worshippers. Funeral ceremonies for important nobles and priests include chocolate preparations designed to ease the transition between life and death. These somber formulations incorporate ingredients associated with the underworld and afterlife, including plants that bloom only in caves and minerals extracted from underground rivers. The chocolate is served in specially designed vessels that are buried with the deceased to provide spiritual nourishment during their journey to the land of the dead. Coming-of-age ceremonies for young nobles include chocolate tastings that symbolically introduce them to adult responsibilities and privileges. The chocolates prepared for these occasions are deliberately complex and sophisticated, requiring developed palates and mature appreciation for subtle flavors. The ability to properly appreciate fine chocolate is considered a mark of noble breeding and cultural refinement. Marriage ceremonies involve chocolate exchanges between families that symbolically unite not just individuals but entire lineages. The chocolates prepared for these occasions include ingredients contributed by both families, mixed according to recipes that represent the blending of different traditions and loyalties. The sharing of chocolate between bride and groom is considered one of the most binding aspects of the marriage ritual. Understanding the economic forces that govern cacao production and chocolate consumption is essential to your role as a master chocolate maker, as these factors affect everything from ingredient availability to political relationships between different regions of the empire. The cacao economy represents one of the most complex and valuable trade networks in all of Mesoamerica. Cacao beans serve a dual function in Aztec society. They're both the raw material for chocolate production and a form of currency used in everyday commercial transactions. A single cacao bean might purchase a small tomato in the market. 100 beans could buy a large turkey. 1,000 beans represent enough value to purchase a small plot of agricultural land. This dual function creates unique economic pressures that affect your work as a chocolate maker. The finest cacao beans are valuable enough that using them for chocolate preparation represents a significant investment that must be justified by the importance of the occasion and the status of the people being served. Imperial chocolate represents one of the most expensive consumables in the entire empire. The geographic distribution of cacao cultivation creates political and economic relationships that extend throughout Mesoamerica. The best-growing regions are located in the hot, humid lowlands along the Pacific and Gulf coasts, far from the highland capital of Tenochtitlan, where the chocolate is ultimately consumed. This geographic separation requires complex trade networks and tribute relationships that can be disrupted by warfare, natural disasters, or political instability. The Soconusco region, which produces the most prized cacao in the empire, is governed through a tributary relationship that requires local rulers to provide specific quantities of beans to the imperial treasury each year. These tribute obligations are carefully calculated to ensure adequate supplies for imperial consumption, while leaving enough cacao for local use and trade with other regions. The quality grading system for cacao beans reflects both economic and spiritual considerations. The largest, most perfect beans are reserved for the emperor and the most important religious ceremonies. Smaller or slightly damaged beans are used for noble consumption and diplomatic gifts. The lowest grades are distributed to warriors, priests, and other palace personnel as part of their compensation packages. Your role in this economic system extends beyond simply processing cacao into chocolate. You're responsible for evaluating the quality of beans delivered to the palace, maintaining inventory records that track the use of different grades of cacao, and advising palace administrators about procurement needs based on anticipated ceremonial requirements. The seasonal nature of cacao production creates supply challenges that require careful planning and resource management. The main harvest occurs during the rainy season, providing the bulk of the year's supply in a relatively short period. This seasonal concentration requires sophisticated storage techniques to maintain bean quality throughout the year. Storage of cacao presents both technical and security challenges. The beans must be kept dry but not desiccated, protected from insects and rodents, and secured against theft by personnel who understand their economic value. The palace maintains multiple storage facilities with different environmental conditions, optimized for different grades of cacao and different intended uses. The international trade in cacao extends beyond the borders of the Aztec Empire to include relationships with Maya kingdoms, Zapotec city-states, and other Mesoamerican civilizations. These trade relationships are maintained through diplomatic missions that often include chocolate makers responsible for demonstrating Aztec chocolate preparation techniques and evaluating foreign cacao varieties. Market fluctuations in cacao values affect imperial budgeting and policy decisions in ways that can impact your work directly. Poor harvests in key growing regions can create shortages that force reductions in chocolate consumption, even within the palace. Exceptional harvests can provide surpluses that enable expanded ceremonial activities and diplomatic initiatives. The labor systems that support cacao cultivation include both free farmers and enslaved workers captured in military campaigns. The treatment of cacao workers reflects the spiritual significance of the crop. Even enslaved workers involved in cacao cultivation receive better food and housing than those working with ordinary agricultural products. Transportation of cacao from growing regions to Tenochtitlan requires coordinated logistics, involving thousands of porters who carry the beans over mountain trails and across lake systems. These supply chains are vulnerable to bandit attacks, tribute rebellions, and natural disasters that can disrupt cacao deliveries for months at a time. The taxation and tribute systems that fund imperial operations depend heavily on cacao revenues, making chocolate production an important factor in maintaining political stability throughout the empire. Regions that fail to meet their cacao tribute obligations face military intervention that can devastate local populations and disrupt production for years. The deepest level of your training as a master chocolate maker involves secret knowledge that's shared only among the most trusted practitioners and is never written down or discussed outside the confines of specially consecrated spaces. This esoteric information encompasses not just advanced techniques, but spiritual practices and supernatural applications that connect chocolate making to the most profound mysteries of Aztec cosmology. The secret knowledge begins with understanding the true spiritual nature of cacao as more than just a plant. According to the deepest teachings, cacao is a living manifestation of divine consciousness that maintains a direct connection to the realm of the gods. Each cacao tree is believed to house a minor deity that must be properly honored and appeased to ensure the quality and potency of its beans. The harvesting of cacao for imperial use involves elaborate rituals that are performed in absolute secrecy by specially trained priests and chocolate makers. These ceremonies include blood offerings, incantations in ancient languages that predate the Aztec Empire, and astronomical calculations that determine the optimal times for gathering beans with maximum spiritual power. The most closely guarded secrets involve the preparation of divinatory chocolate, special formulations that allow trained practitioners to see into the future, communicate with deceased ancestors, and receive direct guidance from the gods. These preparations include rare ingredients that can only be obtained during specific celestial events and must be processed according to techniques that have been passed down through oral tradition for centuries. The divinatory chocolate is prepared only for the emperor and the highest-ranking priests, and its creation requires collaboration between chocolate makers and religious practitioners, who share responsibility for maintaining the spiritual protocols that ensure accurate visions. The process can take weeks to complete and involves multiple purification rituals for both the ingredients and the people involved in preparation. Another category of secret knowledge involves the preparation of transformation chocolate, formulations, that are believed to temporarily alter the consciousness and spiritual essence of those who consume them. These powerful preparations enable priests to take on the characteristics of various animals during religious ceremonies, allowing them to serve as intermediaries between the human and natural worlds. The transformation chocolates require ingredients that are considered so dangerous that their mere possession without proper authorization is punishable by death. Some of these substances can cause permanent psychological changes if used incorrectly, and the techniques for safely incorporating them into chocolate preparations are known only to a handful of master practitioners throughout the empire. Healing. Chocolate represents another area of secret knowledge that overlaps with the most advanced medical practices in Aztec society. The master chocolate makers are trained in diagnostic techniques that allow them to identify specific illnesses and spiritual imbalances, then prepare customized chocolate treatments that address both the physical and metaphysical aspects of disease. These medicinal preparations often include rare minerals, exotic plants, and animal products that must be obtained through elaborate trade networks extending to the furthest reaches of the known world. The proportions and combinations are calculated according to complex systems that take into account not just the patient's symptoms, but their birth date, spiritual constitution, and cosmic influences affecting their condition. The secret knowledge also encompasses techniques for creating chocolate that serves as a form of supernatural protection. Warriors about to enter particularly dangerous battles consume specially prepared chocolate that's believed to make them temporarily invulnerable to enemy weapons. Priests undertaking hazardous spiritual journeys use chocolate preparations to protect them from malevolent spirits and divine wrath. The protective chocolates involve ingredients that are harvested from sacred sites and processed, according to rituals that invoke the direct intervention of protective deities. The preparation must be completed during specific lunar phases and requires the participation of multiple chocolate makers working in perfect synchronization to maintain the spiritual energy necessary for effective protection. Perhaps the most dangerous area of secret knowledge involves the preparation of chocolate that can serve as a weapon against enemies of the empire. These malevolent formulations are designed to cause illness, madness, or death in those who consume them, and their creation requires extensive knowledge of poisonous plants and toxic minerals that must be balanced with other ingredients to avoid detection. The weaponized chocolates are prepared only on direct orders from the emperor and are used primarily against foreign dignitaries who pose threats to imperial security. The techniques for creating these deadly preparations are known only to a select few chocolate makers who have demonstrated absolute loyalty and discretion over many years of service. Training in the secret knowledge requires not just technical instruction but spiritual initiation that transforms the chocolate maker's consciousness and creates permanent bonds to the divine forces that govern cacao. This initiation process involves ritual death and rebirth experiences that can be psychologically devastating for those who aren't properly prepared. Your existence as a master chocolate maker is largely confined to the palace complex, where you live in quarters that reflect both your important status and your need for constant availability to serve imperial requirements. The daily routine combines demanding professional responsibilities with the complex social dynamics of court life, creating a lifestyle that's both privileged and constrained. Your living quarters consist of a small but comfortable room near the kitchen facilities, furnished with a sleeping mat, storage chests for personal belongings, and a small shrine dedicated to cacao, the goddess of chocolate. The room's most important feature is its proximity to your workshop, allowing you to respond quickly to Urgent requests for chocolate preparation at any hour of the day or night. The palace operates according to rigid schedules that govern everything from meal times to religious ceremonies. And your work must be coordinated with dozens of other specialists who serve different aspects of imperial life. The kitchen staff provides you with basic ingredients and maintains the fires needed for roasting cacao. The serving staff delivers your finished chocolate preparations to their ultimate destinations. The cleaning staff maintains your workspace according to strict purity standards. Your daily schedule begins before dawn with personal purification rituals that prepare you spiritually for handling sacred substances. These morning prayers and cleansing ceremonies are considered essential for maintaining the spiritual discipline required for effective chocolate preparation. Skipping or shortening these rituals is believed to compromise the quality of any chocolate you produce that day. After personal preparation comes inspection of your ingredients and workspace to ensure that everything meets the exacting standards required for imperial service. Any contamination, spoilage, or spiritual impurity discovered during these inspections requires extensive cleaning and re-blessing procedures that can delay the day's chocolate production for hours. The preparation of the Emperor's morning chocolate establishes the rhythm for your entire day, as this critical task must be completed within a precise time window that allows for proper serving temperature and optimal spiritual potency. The morning chocolate preparation requires intense concentration and cannot be interrupted, creating a period of focused meditation that sets the tone for subsequent work. Following the Emperor's morning service, you typically have a brief period for your own breakfast, usually simple fare consisting of tortillas, beans, and fruit, accompanied by a modest portion of chocolate that serves as both sustenance and spiritual communion with your craft. These quiet moments provide essential recovery time between the stress of imperial service and the demands of subsequent preparations. The middle portion of your day involves preparing chocolate for various court functions, religious ceremonies, and diplomatic activities that may be scheduled throughout the palace complex. These preparations vary dramatically in complexity and urgency, requiring constant flexibility and adaptation to changing requirements. Court life brings you into regular contact with nobles, priests, and administrators whose favor can significantly impact your working conditions and career prospects. Navigating these relationships requires careful attention to palace politics and social hierarchies that can shift without warning based on imperial whims or factional conflicts. The afternoon period often includes collaborative work with other palace specialists, particularly cooks, herbalists, and religious practitioners who contribute ingredients or expertise to complex chocolate preparations. These collaborations require diplomatic skills and professional courtesy that extend beyond simple technical cooperation. Evening activities vary depending on the palace schedule, but often include preparation work for the following day's requirements, maintenance of equipment and storage areas, and continuing education in new techniques or recipes that may enhance your professional capabilities. Your personal relationships within the palace are complicated by the security requirements and social restrictions that govern court life. Romantic relationships are discouraged among palace staff, as they can create conflicts of loyalty and provide opportunities for security breaches. Friendships must be carefully managed to avoid suspicions of conspiracy or factional alliance. The palace provides basic medical care for staff members, but chocolate makers receive special attention due to their importance to imperial operations. Palace physicians monitor your health carefully, as any illness or incapacity could disrupt chocolate production at critical moments. This medical oversight includes regular evaluation of your mental state, as the stress of imperial service can cause psychological problems that affect work performance. Recreation opportunities within the palace are limited, but include access to gardens, libraries, and certain cultural activities that are considered appropriate for staff members. These leisure activities provide essential mental health benefits, but must be balanced against work responsibilities and security requirements. The seasonal rhythms of palace life affect your work in various ways, from changes in ingredient availability to modifications in ceremonial schedules that alter chocolate preparation requirements. Understanding and adapting to these seasonal variations is an important aspect of maintaining consistent service quality throughout the year. Your position provides access to information about imperial policies, military campaigns, and diplomatic activities that makes you a valuable intelligence asset, but also a potential security risk. Palace administrators monitor your contacts and activities to ensure that sensitive information doesn't reach unauthorized recipients. The vast trading networks that supply your workshop with cacao and other essential ingredients represent one of the most complex commercial systems in the ancient world. Extending from the Arctic regions of North America to the tropical forests of Central America and involving dozens of different cultures, languages, and economic systems. The primary cacao supply chain begins in the coastal lowlands, where the climate and soil conditions are optimal for cacao cultivation. The Soconusco region along the Pacific coast produces the highest quality beans, which are harvested by specialized workers who understand the precise timing required for optimal flavor and spiritual potency. These harvesters must complete their work during narrow windows of opportunity when the cacao pods reach perfect ripeness. From the growing regions, cacao travels along established trade routes that have been developed over centuries of commercial activity. The most important route follows the Pacific coast northward to the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, then crosses overland to the Gulf Coast before continuing north toward the Central Highlands, where Tenochtitlan is located. This overland portion of the journey requires thousands of professional porters who specialize in long-distance transport of valuable commodities. These porters are organized into guilds that maintain strict standards for reliability, security, and speed. A typical cacao shipment might involve several hundred porters, carrying loads of precisely measured weight over distances that can exceed 500 miles. The porter system operates according to complex logistical arrangements that coordinate rest stops, supply provisions, and security escorts throughout the journey. Major trading centers along the routes provide specialized services including lodging, equipment repair, and medical care for porters who suffer injuries or illnesses during their travels. Secondary trade routes supply specialty ingredients that come from more distant regions. Manila travels from the humid forests of the eastern provinces along river systems that connect to the main overland routes. Exotic spices and aromatics come from Maya territories through diplomatic channels that require careful coordination between different political systems. The most valuable and dangerous ingredients come from remote locations that require specialized expeditions to reach. Sacred minerals are extracted from mountain caves that can only be accessed during certain seasons. Rare plants are gathered from jungle areas controlled by hostile tribes that must be negotiated with or fought to gain access to their territories. Weather patterns significantly affect the reliability and timing of ingredient deliveries. The rainy season can make some routes impassable for months at a time, creating supply shortages that require careful inventory management and advanced planning. Drought conditions can affect cacao production quality and reduce overall yields from growing regions. Political instability in tributary regions can disrupt trade relationships and threaten supply security. Rebellions against imperial authority often target trade routes as a way of pressuring the central government. Military campaigns to suppress these rebellions can further disrupt commerce and create uncertainty about future deliveries. The quality control systems for traded ingredients involve inspection procedures that occur at multiple points along the supply chain. Regional administrators are responsible for ensuring that tribute cacao meets imperial standards before it begins the journey to Tenochtitlan. Border officials conduct additional inspections to prevent the smuggling of inferior products or unauthorized goods. Currency systems that govern trade relationships include both cacao, beans themselves, and other valuable commodities that serve as exchange media, precious metals, carved jade, fine textiles, and exotic feathers all serve monetary functions in different trading contexts. Exchange rates between different currencies fluctuate based on supply availability and political relationships. International trade extends beyond the borders of the Aztec Empire to include commercial relationships with Maya kingdoms, Zapotec city-states, and other Mesoamerican civilizations. These relationships require diplomatic protocols that combine commercial negotiation with political alliance building. The Chocolate Makers Guild maintains representatives in major trading centers who monitor ingredient quality, negotiate procurement contracts, and provide technical advice to local suppliers about imperial requirements. These representatives serve as cultural ambassadors who help maintain the relationships necessary for reliable supply chains. Storage and preservation techniques are essential for maintaining ingredient quality during long transport periods. Different substances require different environmental conditions, and the containers used for transport must protect against moisture, temperature fluctuations, and contamination while remaining practical for porter transport. Security measures for valuable shipments include armed escorts, coded documentation systems, and routing strategies designed to minimize exposure to bandit attacks. The most valuable ingredients travel under heavy guard with diversionary shipments, designed to confuse potential thieves about the location and timing of legitimate deliveries. The year 1519 brings unprecedented challenges to your world as strange. Pale-skinned visitors arrive from across the Eastern Sea, bringing with them technologies, diseases, and ideas that will forever change the nature of chocolate making and Aztec civilization itself. The arrival of these foreigners, led by a man named Hernan Cortes, creates both opportunities and threats that require careful navigation. The first encounter with Spanish chocolate preferences occurs when Cortes and his men are invited to participate in diplomatic ceremonies that include traditional chocolate service. Their reaction to the bitter, spiced preparations that you face, perfected over years of training, is one of obvious distaste and cultural confusion. They expect sweetness where you provide complexity, simplicity where you offer sophistication. Moctezuma, believing initially that Cortes might be the returning god, Quetzalcoatl, orders you to prepare special chocolate presentations designed to honor divine visitors. These preparations represent some of your finest work, incorporating the rarest ingredients and most advanced techniques to demonstrate the sophistication of Aztec civilization. But the Spanish response to these elaborate offerings is disappointing and somewhat insulting. They focus on the gold vessels, rather than the chocolate itself, and their comments suggest that they view the preparation as primitive rather than refined. Their lack of appreciation for the spiritual significance of chocolate consumption is particularly troubling today. Priests who oversee ceremonial protocols. As contact between the two cultures intensifies, you begin to learn about Spanish approaches to chocolate that seem almost sacrilegious in their simplicity. The Spanish preference for sweet preparations using honey or cane sugar eliminates the complex bitter flavors that are considered essential for spiritual effectiveness. Their casual consumption of chocolate as mere refreshment ignores the religious protocols that govern proper cacao use. The Spanish interest in cacao as a commodity, rather than a sacred substance, creates new economic pressures that begin to affect ingredient availability and quality. They focus on maximizing production efficiency, rather than maintaining the spiritual purity that has always governed cacao cultivation. Their approach to chocolate making emphasizes speed and quantity over the careful attention to detail that characterizes traditional Aztec methods. Disease outbreaks that accompany Spanish contact devastate. The port networks and trading relationships that supply your workshop with essential ingredients. Smallpox and other European diseases spread rapidly through indigenous populations, killing experienced workers and disrupting the knowledge transfer systems that maintain quality standards. The political instability created by Spanish intervention affects every aspect of palace life, including chocolate production, as Moctezuma struggles to maintain authority while accommodating foreign demands. The resources available for traditional ceremonial activities are reduced. Chocolate preparations that once required the finest ingredients must be modified to use more readily available substitutes. Your personal safety becomes a concern as the Spanish demonstrate willingness to use violence against indigenous populations that resist their demands. The palace, once a secure environment where your main concerns were professional and spiritual, becomes a dangerous place where political miscalculations can have fatal consequences. The Spanish fascination with gold and other precious metals creates opportunities to trade chocolate expertise for personal protection and material benefits. Some chocolate makers begin secretly providing instruction to Spanish colonists who want to establish their own chocolate production capabilities. This knowledge transfer violates traditional secrecy protocols, but offers potential survival advantages. Religious pressure from Spanish missionaries challenges the spiritual foundations of chocolate making that have guided your entire career. The priests who accompany the conquistadors denounce traditional ceremonies as demonic and pressure indigenous practitioners to abandon practices that have connected their people to the divine realm for generations. The introduction of European ingredients and techniques creates possibilities for innovative chocolate preparations that blend Aztec and Spanish approaches. Sugarcane cultivation in Spanish colonies provides new sweetening options that could appeal to foreign palates while maintaining some traditional elements. European spices like cinnamon offer aromatic possibilities that complement traditional cacao flavors. Technical knowledge exchange occurs as Spanish craftsmen observe your chocolate-making techniques and attempt to replicate them using European tools and methods. Their metallurgy skills could improve grinding equipment, while their preservation techniques might extend the shelf life of finished chocolate preparations. The documentation challenges created by Spanish literacy requirements force you to begin writing down recipes and techniques that have always been preserved through oral tradition. This documentation process reveals the complexity of your knowledge, while creating new security risks if the information falls into unauthorized hands. Economic disruption caused by Spanish intervention affects the tribute systems that supply imperial chocolate production. Traditional suppliers may no longer be able or willing to provide cacao under the changed political circumstances, requiring the development of new procurement strategies that work within Spanish colonial systems. As Spanish control over central Mexico becomes increasingly evident, you face the challenge of preserving your chocolate-making expertise while adapting to radically changed political and economic circumstances. Survival requires careful navigation between maintaining traditional practices and accommodating new colonial realities. The collapse of traditional imperial authority eliminates many of the formal structures that have governed chocolate production throughout your career. The emperor's personal service, which once provided your primary purpose and identity, becomes impossible as Moctezuma dies and Spanish administrators assume control of palace operations. Spanish colonial officials show little interest in maintaining the elaborate ceremonial chocolate preparations that have been central to Aztec religious and political life. They view these activities as wasteful expenditures that divert resources from more profitable economic activities. The reduction in demand for ceremonial chocolate eliminates many employment opportunities for traditional practitioners. However, Spanish interest in chocolate as a commercial product creates new opportunities for those willing to adapt their techniques to European preferences and production methods. The potential export market to Spain and other European countries could provide sustainable income for chocolate makers who can successfully modify their approaches. The adaptation process requires learning to work with new ingredients that appeal to European tastes while maintaining enough traditional elements to preserve the essential character of chocolate preparations. Sugar integration becomes a critical skill, as Spanish consumers expect sweetness levels that would have been considered inappropriate in traditional Aztec chocolate. Working with Spanish colonial administrators requires developing new diplomatic and communication skills that enable effective collaboration across cultural boundaries. Understanding Spanish priorities and business practices becomes as important as technical chocolate-making expertise for securing ongoing employment opportunities. The religious challenges posed by Spanish missionary activity require careful balance between maintaining traditional spiritual practices and avoiding persecution for participating in activities that colonial authorities consider heretical. Some chocolate makers choose to publicly convert to Christianity while privately maintaining traditional beliefs and practices. Language learning becomes essential for communicating with Spanish supervisors and customers who may become the primary market for chocolate products under colonial rule. Technical vocabulary must be developed to describe chocolate-making processes in Spanish terms that colonial administrators can understand and document. Equipment adaptation involves modifying traditional tools and techniques to work with Spanish materials and production methods. Metal grinding devices introduced by European craftsmen offer potential improvements in efficiency and consistency, but require learning new operational procedures that maintain quality standards. Quality control systems must be developed that satisfy both traditional standards for spiritual effectiveness and Spanish requirements for commercial consistency. Creating products that meet dual criteria requires innovative approaches that respect both cultural traditions and colonial market demands. Training programs for Spanish apprentices create opportunities to share knowledge while ensuring ongoing employment in chocolate production under colonial management. Teaching European students requires developing new instructional methods that communicate complex cultural concepts across linguistic and cultural barriers. Documentation systems that satisfy Spanish administrative requirements while protecting sensitive traditional knowledge require careful balance between transparency and discretion. Creating records that demonstrate productivity and value without revealing spiritual or strategic information becomes a complex challenge. Supply chain adaptation involves developing relationships with new suppliers who can operate effectively under colonial economic systems. Traditional tribute relationships must be replaced with commercial arrangements that function within Spanish legal and regulatory frameworks. Product development efforts focus on creating chocolate preparations that appeal to European markets while maintaining some connection to traditional Aztec approaches. Innovation becomes necessary for survival, but must be balanced against the risk of completely abandoning cultural heritage. Economic planning requires understanding Spanish colonial economic policies and their likely effects on chocolate production and marketing. Currency systems, taxation policies, and trade regulations all affect the viability of different business strategies for chocolate makers seeking to continue their careers under colonial rule. Personal safety considerations involve avoiding activities or associations that might be interpreted as resistance to Spanish authority. Maintaining low profiles while preserving essential skills and knowledge requires constant vigilance and careful judgment about when to reveal or conceal traditional expertise. As the traditional world of Aztec chocolate making faces irreversible transformation under Spanish colonial rule, you grapple with questions about how to preserve and transmit the sophisticated knowledge that has been developed over generations of master practitioners. The challenge involves balancing cultural preservation with practical adaptation to changed circumstances. The oral tradition that has preserved chocolate-making knowledge for centuries faces disruption as the community of practitioners is scattered by colonial political changes. Master chocolate makers who once provided instruction and continuity are no longer available to train new students according to traditional methods. The knowledge transfer systems that have maintained quality and consistency are breaking down. Written documentation of traditional techniques becomes both necessary and dangerous. Necessary for preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost, but dangerous because written records can be discovered and misused by people who lack the cultural context necessary for proper understanding and application. The selection process for sharing knowledge with Spanish students requires careful evaluation of their motivations, capabilities, and likely uses for chocolate-making information. Some colonial administrators genuinely respect indigenous expertise and seek to learn traditional methods for appropriate applications. Others view indigenous knowledge as simply another resource to be exploited for commercial or political advantage. Partial knowledge transfer emerges as a survival strategy that provides enough information to demonstrate value and secure employment, while withholding the most sensitive spiritual and technical details that could be misused. Teaching basic chocolate preparation techniques while preserving advanced ceremonial knowledge allows for cultural continuity within acceptable colonial parameters. Underground networks of traditional practitioners develop communication systems that allow continued sharing of knowledge among trusted indigenous chocolate makers who remain committed to preserving cultural heritage. These networks operate discreetly to avoid attracting colonial attention while maintaining the relationships necessary for knowledge preservation. Symbolic encoding of traditional recipes and techniques creates documentation methods that appear innocuous to colonial observers while preserving essential information for those who understand the cultural codes. Traditional stories, songs, and artistic representations can carry technical information that survives even when direct instruction becomes impossible. Hybrid training programs that combine traditional Aztec methods with acceptable Spanish approaches offer possibilities for preserving essential knowledge while adapting to colonial expectations. Students trained in these programs can function effectively in colonial economic systems while maintaining connections to traditional cultural values. The spiritual dimensions of chocolate-making knowledge present particular challenges for preservation under Christian colonial rule. Religious practices that are integral to traditional chocolate preparation cannot be openly maintained, but their essential elements might be preserved through private observance and symbolic representation. Family-based preservation strategies involve teaching traditional knowledge to children and relatives who might be able to maintain cultural continuity, even if professional chocolate-making opportunities become unavailable. Domestic preservation of techniques and recipes could ensure survival of knowledge through periods of cultural suppression. Regional variations in colonial policies create different opportunities for knowledge preservation in different areas. Some Spanish administrators show more tolerance for indigenous cultural practices than others, creating pockets where traditional chocolate making might continue with less interference. Economic incentives for knowledge preservation emerge as visioned. Spanish markets develop appreciation for chocolate products that incorporate traditional expertise. Commercial success with hybrid approaches could provide sustainable support for maintaining cultural knowledge while adapting to colonial economic systems. Documentation in indigenous languages preserves traditional terminology and conceptual frameworks that might be lost if knowledge is only recorded in Spanish. Maintaining native language records ensures that future generations can access traditional knowledge in its original cultural context. Apprenticeship modifications adapt traditional master-student relationships to function within colonial educational and economic systems. Informal instruction methods that don't attract official attention could preserve essential knowledge transfer relationships despite changes in formal institutional structures. Cross-cultural marriage relationships create opportunities for knowledge preservation through family connections that bridge indigenous and Spanish communities. Spanish spouses who appreciate traditional chocolate-making expertise might support preservation efforts that would be discouraged in purely colonial contexts. International preservation networks that connect indigenous practitioners across different colonial territories could maintain knowledge-sharing relationships that transcend local political boundaries. Communication between Maya, Aztec, and other Mesoamerican chocolate makers could preserve regional variations and specialized techniques. The fundamental nature of chocolate itself undergoes dramatic transformation as Spanish colonial influence introduces new ingredients, techniques, and cultural meanings that alter both the preparation and consumption of cacao-based beverages. These changes represent more than simple recipe modifications. They reflect profound shifts in the cultural significance and social role of chocolate in Mesoamerican society. The introduction of sugarcane cultivation to New Spain provides Spanish colonists with sweetening options that fundamentally change chocolate flavor profiles. Where traditional Aztec chocolate emphasized bitter complexity balanced with subtle spicing, Spanish-influenced preparations focus on sweetness levels that would have been considered inappropriate or even spiritually corrupting in pre-conquest contexts. European spices imported through Spanish trade networks offer new aromatic possibilities that can enhance or overwhelm traditional cacao flavors. Cinnamon, brought from Asian colonies, provides warmth and sweetness that complements cacao while creating flavor combinations that appeal to European palates. Black pepper offers heat that can substitute for traditional chili preparations, while providing more familiar sensations for Spanish consumers. The Spanish preference for hot beverages, rather than the room temperature preparations traditional in Aztec culture, requires modifications to preparation techniques and serving methods. Heating chocolate to European temperature preferences affects both flavor development and spiritual properties that have been central to traditional consumption practices. Dairy products introduced by Spanish livestock create possibilities for chocolate preparations that incorporate milk or cream, fundamentally altering both texture and nutritional content. These modifications appeal to European dietary preferences while creating products that bear little resemblance to traditional Aztec chocolate beverages. The secularization of chocolate consumption under Spanish influence eliminates the religious protocols and spiritual significance that have governed traditional cacao use. Colonial chocolate consumption focuses on pleasure and nutrition rather than divine communion and ceremonial significance, representing a fundamental shift in cultural meaning. Commercial production methods introduced by Spanish entrepreneurs emphasize efficiency and consistency over the spiritual purity and individual attention that have characterized traditional chocolate making. Mass production techniques reduce costs and increase availability while eliminating the personalized preparation that has been central to traditional practice. Export market development creates demand for chocolate products that can survive long ocean voyages to European markets. This requirement drives innovation in preservation techniques and product stability while introducing commercial considerations that may conflict with traditional quality standards. Plantation agriculture systems developed by Spanish colonists for cacao cultivation emphasize yield maximization over the spiritual and environmental considerations that have guided traditional growing practices. Industrial agriculture methods increase production, but may compromise the quality and spiritual potency that have been central to traditional cacao use. The elimination of indigenous labor systems and their replacement with Spanish colonial economic Arrangements affects every aspect of chocolate production, from cacao cultivation through final preparation. New labor relationships alter the social and cultural contexts within which chocolate making. Knowledge has been developed and transmitted. Legal frameworks established by Spanish colonial administration create new regulatory environments that govern chocolate production, trade, and consumption. Colonial laws may conflict with traditional practices, while establishing new standards and requirements that affect how chocolate making can be practiced. Urban development patterns in Spanish. Colonial cities create new contexts for chocolate consumption that differ significantly from traditional Aztec palace and ceremonial settings. Commercial chocolate houses and domestic consumption create different social meanings and usage patterns for chocolate products. Gender role modifications under Spanish colonial influence affect who can participate in chocolate making and how. Expertise is transmitted between generations. Colonial gender expectations may restrict opportunities for women practitioners while altering the family-based knowledge transfer systems that have preserved traditional expertise. Educational system changes introduced by Spanish missionaries and administrators create new methods for knowledge transmission that may conflict with traditional oral instruction approaches. Formal schooling systems could provide new opportunities for chocolate-making education while potentially undermining traditional master-apprentice relationships. Religious syncretism that combines Christian and indigenous spiritual practices creates possibilities for maintaining some traditional chocolate ceremonial elements within acceptable colonial religious frameworks. Hybrid spiritual practices could preserve essential cultural meanings while adapting to colonial religious requirements. Technological innovations introduced by Spanish craftsmen offer possibilities for improving chocolate production efficiency and quality through better grinding. Equipment, more precise measurement tools, and improved storage methods. European technological approaches could enhance traditional techniques while maintaining cultural authenticity. As you stand in your workshop in the early morning hours, grinding cacao beans according to techniques that stretch back through generations of master practitioners, you reflect on the extraordinary journey that has brought you from a young apprentice learning basic skills to a master craftsman witnessing the transformation of an entire civilization. The weight of history rests in your hands along with the sacred beams that connect you to both ancient traditions and an uncertain future. The changes you've witnessed over the past months have forced you to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the nature of your craft and its place in the world. What once seemed like eternal traditions governing chocolate preparation now appear as cultural practices that can be modified, abandoned, or transformed according to political and economic pressures that extend far beyond the spiritual realm where you believed chocolate making properly belonged. The Spanish presence has introduced new perspectives on the value and significance of your expertise that are both flattering and disturbing. Colonial administrators recognize the commercial potential of chocolate production knowledge while showing little appreciation for the spiritual and cultural dimensions that have made this work meaningful to you. Their focus on efficiency and profit maximization conflicts with traditional approaches that emphasize spiritual purity and ceremonial significance. Yet you've also discovered unexpected opportunities for creativity and innovation that might not have emerged without the pressure to adapt traditional methods to new circumstances. Working with Spanish ingredients and techniques has expanded your understanding of cacao's possibilities while challenging you to maintain essential cultural elements within modified preparation approaches. The question of knowledge preservation weighs heavily on your mind as you consider how to ensure that future generations might have access to traditional chocolate making expertise, even if current political circumstances make full traditional practice impossible. The techniques you've mastered represent centuries of accumulated wisdom that could be lost forever if not properly transmitted to appropriate students. Your relationship with traditional spiritual practices has evolved as you navigate the challenges of maintaining indigenous religious observances while avoiding persecution from Spanish colonial authorities. The private ceremonies that once provided spiritual foundation for your chocolate making must now be conducted with extreme discretion, adding psychological stress to already demanding professional responsibilities. The economic uncertainties created by colonial political changes affect your planning for both immediate survival and long-term career development. Traditional employment structures that provided security and status for master chocolate makers are disappearing, requiring development of new economic strategies that function within Spanish colonial systems. Personal relationships with other chocolate makers have become more important as traditional institutional supports break down. Informal networks of practitioners provide emotional support, technical advice, and collaborative opportunities that help maintain professional competence despite the absence of formal training and supervision structures. The physical demands of chocolate making, which once seemed manageable within stable institutional frameworks, have become more challenging. As working conditions deteriorate under colonial administration, increased production pressures and reduced resources affect both the quality of your work environment and your ability to maintain health and energy levels necessary for demanding preparation procedures. Your sense of cultural identity has been tested by the need to balance traditional values with practical adaptation to colonial realities. Maintaining pride in indigenous heritage while developing skills necessary for survival in Spanish-dominated society requires constant navigation between competing demands and conflicting loyalties. The students you've begun training represent both hope for cultural continuity and concern about knowledge dilution as traditional instruction methods are modified to accommodate colonial circumstances. Teaching Spanish apprentices requires developing new pedagogical approaches that communicate essential concepts across cultural boundaries while preserving core technical and spiritual elements, dreams and aspirations that once focused on advancement within traditional Aztec ceremonial and political structures must now be reconsidered in light of colonial opportunities and constraints. Personal goals that seemed achievable within indigenous institutional frameworks may no longer be relevant, requiring development of new life plans that account for radically changed circumstances. The daily routine of chocolate preparation continues to provide stability and meaning despite external chaos, as the fundamental processes of roasting, grinding, and mixing remain essentially unchanged regardless of political circumstances. The meditative aspects of traditional techniques offer psychological refuge from the stress and uncertainty that characterize life under colonial rule. Looking toward the future, you see possibilities for contributing to the development of new chocolate traditions that honor indigenous heritage while adapting to colonial realities. Your expertise could help shape how chocolate evolves in the Spanish colonial context while preserving essential elements of traditional practice for future generations. The news arrives on a humid morning in late 1520. Tenochtitlan has fallen to the Spanish forces. Moctezuma is dead, and the Aztec Empire as you have known it throughout your entire life has ceased to exist. As you stand in your workshop, surrounded by the tools and ingredients that have defined your identity for so many years, you must make the most important decision of your life: how to preserve what can be saved from the wreckage of a civilization. Courts has issued proclamations requiring all palace personnel to report to Spanish administrators for reassignment or dismissal. The fate of individual servants depends on their perceived value to the new colonial government and their willingness to collaborate with Spanish authorities. Your expertise in chocolate preparation might be valuable enough to ensure survival, but only if you're willing to adapt your practices to Spanish preferences and requirements. The sacred chocolate stores that you've maintained for imperial ceremonies, face immediate dispersal as Spanish soldiers searched the palace for gold and other valuable materials. The finest cacao beans, some aged for years to achieve perfect spiritual potency, are being treated as ordinary commodities to be distributed or sold according to Spanish commercial practices. Your fellow chocolate makers are scattered throughout the city, some seeking refuge with indigenous communities that might preserve traditional practices, others attempting to negotiate employment with Spanish colonists who recognize the commercial potential of chocolate production. The community of practitioners that has supported your professional development for decades is fragmenting under colonial pressure. The decision to preserve your most important recipes requires choosing between written documentation that could be discovered and misused, an oral transmission to students who might not survive the political upheaval that continues to devastate the indigenous population. Either choice involves risks that could result in the permanent loss of knowledge that represents generations of accumulated wisdom. The selection of essential ingredients for personal preservation must balance practical transportation limitations against the need to maintain capability for traditional chocolate preparation. Some rare substances might never be available again. If current supplies are lost, but carrying valuable materials also increases personal danger during the uncertain times ahead. As colonial rule becomes more established and the immediate crisis of survival transitions into the long-term challenge of cultural adaptation, you increasingly focus on strategies for preserving essential elements of traditional chocolate making. Knowledge within the constraints and opportunities of Spanish colonial society. The task requires balancing visible collaboration with colonial authorities against discreet preservation of indigenous cultural heritage. The development of coded instruction methods allows you to teach traditional techniques to indigenous students while avoiding colonial suspicion about the transmission of potentially subversive cultural knowledge. Traditional stories, songs, and artistic representations carry technical information that can be preserved and transmitted without attracting administrative attention. Underground networks of indigenous practitioners who maintain traditional approaches in remote areas provide opportunities for authentic knowledge preservation and spiritual continuity. These communities offer refuge for cultural practices that cannot be openly observed in colonial, urban settings while maintaining connections to traditional spiritual and technical knowledge. Written documentation in indigenous languages preserves traditional terminology and conceptual frameworks that are being lost as Spanish becomes the dominant language for technical instruction and commercial communication. Maintaining native language records ensures that future generations might access traditional knowledge in its original cultural context. Family-based preservation strategies involve teaching traditional knowledge to children and relatives who might be able to maintain cultural continuity even if professional chocolate-making opportunities become completely colonized. Domestic preservation of techniques and recipes could ensure knowledge survival through periods of cultural suppression. Religious syncretism that incorporates traditional chocolate ceremonies into acceptable Christian frameworks allows for continued observance of essential spiritual practices, while avoiding persecution for maintaining prohibited indigenous religions. Private ceremonies adapted to colonial religious requirements preserve spiritual connections to traditional practices. Economic strategies that use commercial success to support cultural preservation activities create resources for traditional knowledge maintenance while demonstrating indigenous value within colonial economic systems. Profits from Spanish chocolate production can fund discrete preservation efforts that maintain traditional practices. Regional networks that connect indigenous practitioners across different colonial territories maintain knowledge-sharing relationships that transcend local political boundaries. Communication between Maya, Aztec, and other Mesoamerican chocolate makers preserves regional variations and specialized techniques that might otherwise be lost. Educational innovations that adapt traditional master-apprentice. Relationships to function within colonial social and legal frameworks preserve essential. Knowledge transfer methods while avoiding conflicts with colonial educational and religious. Authorities. Modified instruction approaches maintain cultural transmission within acceptable institutional contexts. Hybrid product development that combines traditional techniques with acceptable colonial modifications creates market opportunities while preserving essential cultural elements. Products that appeal to Spanish consumers while maintaining indigenous. Technical and spiritual integrity could provide sustainable support for traditional knowledge preservation. Documentation strategies that record essential information in forms that appear innocuous to colonial observers, while preserving complex traditional knowledge for initiated practitioners. Symbolic encoding and metaphorical language protect sensitive information while ensuring its transmission to appropriate recipients. International preservation efforts that connect with indigenous communities in other Spanish colonies create broader networks for cultural maintenance and mutual support. Shared experiences of colonial adaptation and resistance provide resources for developing effective preservation strategies. Spiritual resistance activities that maintain traditional religious observances through discrete private practice preserve the cultural foundations that give meaning to traditional chocolate-making techniques. Underground spiritual communities provide emotional and psychological support for cultural preservation efforts. Technological adaptation that incorporates useful Spanish innovations while maintaining traditional approaches where they remain superior creates hybrid systems that function effectively in colonial contexts while preserving essential cultural knowledge. Selective adoption of colonial technologies enhances traditional practices without compromising their integrity. Material culture preservation that maintains traditional tools, vessels, and sacred objects provides tangible connections to indigenous heritage while supporting continued traditional practice. Hidden storage and discreet use of traditional equipment preserves cultural authenticity within colonial contexts. Oral tradition. Maintenance that preserves traditional stories, songs, and ceremonial knowledge ensures cultural continuity despite colonial efforts to suppress indigenous religions and cultural practices. Memory-based preservation methods protect sensitive information while enabling its transmission to future generations. The years of colonial adaptation gradually transform your understanding of yourself and your role in a world that bears little resemblance to the one where you first learned chocolate-making techniques. Your identity as a master practitioner of sacred arts evolves into something more complex and ambiguous as you navigate between traditional values and colonial realities. The daily practice of chocolate making continues to provide connection to traditional culture and spiritual values, despite the radically changed context within which you now work. The fundamental processes of roasting, grinding, and mixing remain essentially unchanged, regardless of political circumstances, offering continuity and meaning amid external chaos and uncertainty. Professional relationships with Spanish colonial administrators and students create new social dynamics that require constant negotiation between indigenous heritage and colonial expectations. Your expertise provides leverage for maintaining some autonomy and respect, while your cultural background subjects you to ongoing discrimination and suspicion. The commercial success of your chocolate production operation provides economic security and social status within colonial society while raising questions about the commodification of sacred practices that were once restricted to ceremonial and religious contexts. Material prosperity achieved through cultural adaptation creates both opportunities and moral dilemmas. Relationships with other indigenous practitioners who have made different choices about collaboration versus resistance provide perspectives on alternative strategies for cultural survival and identity maintenance. Comparing your approach with those of others helps clarify the benefits and costs of different adaptation strategies. The training of both Spanish and indigenous students in modified chocolate making techniques creates a legacy that combines traditional knowledge with colonial innovations. Your teaching preserves essential cultural elements while adapting them for survival in fundamentally changed circumstances. Spiritual practice that blends traditional indigenous observances with acceptable colonial religious requirements provides personal meaning and cultural connection while avoiding persecution for maintaining prohibited beliefs and practices. Syncretistic spirituality preserves essential elements while adapting to colonial religious constraints. Family relationships that span traditional indigenous culture and colonial Spanish society create complex loyalties and identities that reflect broader patterns of cultural mixing and adaptation. Personal connections bridge cultural boundaries while maintaining important heritage links. Economic strategies that use commercial chocolate production to support traditional knowledge preservation and cultural activities create resources for maintaining indigenous heritage within colonial economic systems. Financial success enables cultural preservation activities that would otherwise be impossible. Political awareness of colonial policies and their effects on indigenous communities influences decisions about collaboration, resistance, and adaptation. Strategies. Understanding Spanish colonial objectives and methods helps inform choices about how to preserve cultural heritage while ensuring physical survival. Technological expertise that combines traditional indigenous knowledge with Spanish colonial innovations creates hybrid approaches that function effectively in colonial contexts while preserving essential cultural elements. Technical adaptation demonstrates indigenous value while maintaining cultural integrity. Cultural mediation between indigenous communities and Spanish colonial authorities provides opportunities for protecting traditional knowledge and practices while facilitating communication and cooperation across cultural boundaries. Bridge-building roles enable cultural preservation while supporting community survival. Language skills that include traditional indigenous languages and colonial Spanish create communication capabilities that function effectively in multiple cultural contexts as while preserving important heritage connections. Multilingual competence enables cultural preservation while facilitating colonial adaptation. Educational activities that transmit traditional knowledge through modified instruction. Methods adapted to colonial circumstances preserve cultural heritage while ensuring its relevance for future generations. Teaching creates cultural continuity while adapting to changed social and political contexts. Memory work that preserves traditional knowledge, stories, and spiritual practices through mental discipline and oral transmission maintains cultural heritage in forms that resist colonial documentation and control efforts. Mental preservation protects sensitive information while ensuring its transmission identity. Synthesis that integrates traditional indigenous values with colonial survival strategies creates new forms of cultural expression that honor heritage while adapting to contemporary realities. Hybrid identity enables effective functioning in colonial society while maintaining essential cultural connections. The responsibility for transmitting chocolate-making knowledge to students who will practice in a fundamentally different world than the one where you learn these techniques requires developing new pedagogical approaches that preserve essential elements while adapting to radically changed circumstances. Your students represent the future of chocolate making, but their training must prepare them for realities that didn't exist when traditional methods were developed. Spanish students who seek chocolate making instruction for commercial purposes approach the subject with entrepreneurial attitudes that focus on efficiency, profitability, and market appeal rather than the spiritual and cultural dimensions that have traditionally given meaning to this work. Teaching them requires finding ways to communicate technical excellence while respecting their different motivations and values. Indigenous students who are learning modified techniques for survival in colonial economic systems need instruction that preserves traditional knowledge while adapting it for employment under Spanish supervision. Their training must balance cultural preservation against practical requirements for functioning effectively in colonial commercial contexts. Mixed classes that include both Spanish and Indigenous students create complex dynamics that require careful management to ensure effective knowledge transmission while avoiding cultural conflicts or political tensions. Teaching across cultural boundaries demands diplomatic skills as well as technical expertise. Curriculum development that combines traditional techniques with Spanish innovations creates hybrid instruction programs that function effectively in colonial contexts while preserving essential cultural knowledge. Course content must address both traditional quality standards and commercial market requirements. Language instruction that enables students to understand technical terminology in both Indigenous and Spanish languages. Preserves traditional conceptual frameworks while developing communication capabilities necessary for colonial commercial success. Bilingual technical education maintains cultural connections while enabling practical adaptation. Safety training that addresses the hazards of chocolate making while incorporating traditional spiritual protections and modern practical precautions. Ensures student welfare while respecting cultural values. Comprehensive safety education combines Indigenous wisdom with Spanish innovations. Quality control instruction that maintains traditional standards while adapting to colonial commercial requirements. Teaches students to recognize and achieve excellence. Within different evaluation frameworks, multiple quality criteria enable products that satisfy both cultural and commercial standards. Business skills education that prepares students for colonial economic systems while preserving traditional values about appropriate relationships between spiritual practice and material prosperity. Commercial training addresses practical survival needs while maintaining cultural integrity. Cultural sensitivity instruction that helps Spanish students understand the spiritual and historical significance of chocolate making while teaching Indigenous students to navigate colonial cultural expectations. Cross-cultural education facilitates mutual understanding and respect. Advanced technique instruction that preserves sophisticated traditional methods while adapting them for colonial tools and ingredients ensures that complex knowledge isn't lost through oversimplification. Technical depth maintains traditional excellence while enabling practical adaptation. Innovation training that encourages creative adaptation of traditional methods to address colonial challenges while maintaining essential cultural elements. Innovative instruction develops problem-solving capabilities while preserving cultural authenticity. Spiritual instruction that communicates traditional religious and cultural meanings within acceptable colonial frameworks preserves essential knowledge while avoiding persecution for maintaining prohibited beliefs. Adapted spiritual education maintains cultural connections while ensuring student safety. Professional ethics instruction that addresses moral dilemmas created by practicing traditional arts within colonial economic and political systems. Ethical education helps students navigate complex loyalty conflicts while maintaining personal integrity. Historical education that helps students understand the traditional cultural context of chocolate-making techniques while preparing them to adapt these methods for contemporary circumstances. Historical knowledge provides foundation for informed adaptation and cultural preservation. Network building instruction that teaches students to maintain connections with other practitioners who can provide ongoing support. Knowledge exchange and cultural preservation opportunities. Professional network development ensures continuing education and cultural continuity. Documentation training that teaches students to record essential knowledge while protecting sensitive information from unauthorized access or misuse. Information management skills preserve knowledge while maintaining appropriate security. Adaptation skills instruction that develops students capabilities for modifying traditional techniques to address changing circumstances, while preserving essential quality and cultural elements. Flexibility training enables survival and success in dynamic colonial contexts. Mentorship development prepares advanced students to teach others and maintain knowledge transmission systems that can function independently of formal institutional support. Leadership training ensures continuing cultural preservation and professional development. Assessment methods that evaluate student competence in both traditional techniques and colonial adaptations ensure comprehensive preparation for professional practice in contemporary circumstances. Multiple evaluation criteria address different aspects of professional competence while maintaining traditional standards. Your role in establishing chocolate production within Spanish colonial Mexico provides a unique perspective on how this sacred beverage is being transformed from an indigenous ceremonial drink into a global commodity that will eventually reach every corner of the European world and beyond. The changes you witness represent just the beginning of chocolate's journey from temple to marketplace. Reports from Spanish traders who carry your chocolate preparations to Europe describe enthusiastic reception among wealthy consumers who appreciate the exotic flavors and stimulating properties, though often without understanding the cultural significance that originally made these beverages meaningful. European demand creates opportunities for expanded production while challenging traditional approaches to quality and authenticity. The development of chocolate houses in Spanish cities creates new contexts for consumption that bear little resemblance to traditional ceremonial settings. These commercial establishments focus on social interaction and pleasure rather than spiritual communion, representing fundamental shifts in the cultural meaning and social role of chocolate consumption. Adaptation of chocolate recipes for European palates continues to drive modifications that increase sweetness, while reducing the complex bitter and spicy flavors that characterize traditional preparations. Sugar integration becomes standard practice, creating products that appeal to foreign consumers while departing significantly from indigenous traditions. Technical innovations developed by Spanish craftsmen improve production efficiency and product consistency while potentially compromising some traditional quality aspects. Metal grinding equipment produces smoother textures than traditional stone tools, but may affect spiritual properties that indigenous practitioners consider essential. Export logistics for shipping chocolate to European markets require development of preservation techniques and packaging methods that maintain product quality during long ocean voyages. Commercial stability requirements drive innovations that prioritize shelf life over traditional freshness and spiritual potency. International trade networks that distribute Mexican chocolate throughout Spanish colonial territories and European markets create demand for standardized products that can be produced consistently across different locations and practitioners. Standardization requirements conflict with traditional approaches that emphasized individual preparation and spiritual attention. Plantation agriculture systems developed for large-scale cacao cultivation emphasize yield maximization and cost reduction over traditional growing practices that focused on spiritual purity and environmental harmony. Industrial agriculture methods increase production while potentially compromising the quality that made traditional cacao special. Labor systems that support expanded chocolate production rely increasingly on enslaved workers rather than the skilled indigenous practitioners who developed traditional techniques. Forced labor reduces production costs, while eliminating the cultural knowledge and spiritual discipline that characterize traditional practice. Cultural appropriation patterns that strip traditional practices of their indigenous spiritual and cultural meanings while adopting technical methods for commercial purposes represent broader colonial patterns of exploitation that affect all aspects of indigenous knowledge and culture. religious transformation that eliminates traditional spiritual practices while maintaining technical procedures, creates secularized chocolate production that serves commercial rather than ceremonial purposes. Religious suppression removes essential cultural elements while preserving only economically valuable aspects. Scientific investigation of chocolate properties by European scholars attempts to understand traditional techniques through colonial intellectual frameworks that may miss important cultural and spiritual dimensions. Academic study produces knowledge that serves colonial interests while potentially overlooking indigenous wisdom. Medical applications of chocolate that incorporate traditional therapeutic knowledge into European healing practices create hybrid treatments that combine indigenous expertise with colonial medical systems. Therapeutic uses preserve some traditional knowledge while adapting it for colonial contexts. Diplomatic applications that use chocolate gifts to facilitate political relationships between Spanish colonial authorities and indigenous communities create new political meanings for traditional practices. Chocolate diplomacy serves colonial objectives while providing some opportunities for cultural expression. Economic development that transforms chocolate from ceremonial beverage to commercial commodity creates wealth for Spanish colonial interests while disrupting traditional economic relationships that supported indigenous communities. Commercial development benefits colonizers while often impoverishing traditional practitioners. Cultural synthesis that combines indigenous techniques with Spanish innovations creates new forms of chocolate production that function within colonial systems. While preserving some traditional elements, hybrid practices enable survival and adaptation while maintaining cultural connections. Global expansion that carries chocolate beyond Mexico to other Spanish colonies and European markets creates international demand that drives continued innovation and adaptation. Worldwide distribution spreads modified chocolate practices while further diluting traditional cultural meanings. Technological diffusion that spreads chocolate, making techniques to other regions and cultures, creates variations that adapt basic methods to different local conditions and preferences. Technical adaptation produces regional variations while moving further from traditional origins. Social transformation that changes chocolate from sacred substance to secular pleasure alters fundamental relationships between production, consumption, and cultural meaning. Social change eliminates traditional contexts while creating new opportunities for cultural expression. Educational dissemination that teaches chocolate-making techniques through colonial educational systems spreads technical knowledge while often eliminating cultural context and spiritual significance. Educational expansion preserves some technical knowledge while potentially losing cultural meaning. As you approach the later years of your career in chocolate making, the full scope of the historical transformation you've witnessed begins to crystallize into patterns that reveal both the resilience and fragility of cultural traditions facing fundamental change. Your personal experience spans the collapse of one world and the emergence of another, providing unique insights into how knowledge, identity, and meaning survive or perish during periods of radical historical disruption. The traditional world of Aztec chocolate making that provided the foundation for your early career has been so thoroughly transformed that young practitioners trained in colonial methods can barely comprehend the spiritual and cultural frameworks that once gave meaning to these techniques. The speed and completeness of this transformation demonstrates how quickly complex cultural systems can be disrupted by external political and economic forces. Your role as cultural bridge between indigenous traditions and colonial innovations has required constant navigation between competing loyalties and conflicting values that reflect broader patterns of survival and adaptation among indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. The compromises necessary for cultural and physical survival create moral complexities that defy simple judgment about collaboration versus resistance. The knowledge you've preserved through oral transmission, written documentation, and practical instruction represents just a fraction of the sophisticated understanding that once characterized traditional chocolate making. Much has been lost forever, sacrificed to the immediate needs of survival and adaptation during periods when cultural preservation seemed less important than physical and economic security. Students you've trained now work throughout Spanish colonial territories, carrying modified versions of traditional techniques to new locations and contexts where they will undoubtedly undergo further adaptation and transformation. The evolution continues beyond your direct influence, creating variations that may eventually bear little resemblance to traditional origins. The commercial success of colonial chocolate production has generated wealth and opportunities that wouldn't have existed within traditional Aztec economic systems. But these benefits have come at the cost of spiritual meaning and cultural authenticity that once made this work personally fulfilling. Material prosperity achieved through cultural compromise creates ambiguous legacies. Relationships with surviving traditional practitioners who maintained orthodox approaches in isolated communities provide connections to authentic cultural heritage, while highlighting the extent to which your own practice has been modified by colonial adaptation. Comparative perspectives reveal both the benefits and costs of different survival strategies. The documentation you've created to preserve essential knowledge for future generations represents an attempt to bridge temporal gaps that separate traditional culture from unknown future circumstances. Whether these records will prove useful or meaningful to practitioners who inherit fundamentally different cultural contexts remains uncertain. Spanish colonial policies that initially encouraged indigenous knowledge preservation for economic benefit have gradually shifted toward cultural suppression and religious conversion that threaten even modified traditional practices. Political changes beyond your control continue to affect the context within which cultural preservation efforts must operate. The globalization of chocolate that began with your early instruction of Spanish students now extends to European markets and beyond, creating international demand that drives continued innovation while moving ever further from traditional origins. Your local cultural preservation efforts operate within increasingly global economic systems, family relationships that span indigenous and colonial cultures reflect broader patterns of cultural mixing and identity formation that characterize colonial societies throughout the Americas. Personal experiences of cultural adaptation provide microcosm perspectives on historical processes that affect entire civilizations. The psychological toll of witnessing cultural destruction while participating in cultural transformation has created internal conflicts that resist easy resolution. The emotional cost of adaptation includes grief for lost traditions, guilt about cultural compromise, and uncertainty about the value and meaning of preservation efforts. Spiritual practices that combine traditional indigenous observances with colonial religious requirements provide personal meaning while raising questions about authenticity and integrity that affect individual identity and community relationships. Religious syncretism enables survival while creating theological and cultural complexities. Economic strategies that use commercial success to support cultural preservation activities demonstrate possibilities for leveraging colonial systems to serve traditional values, while also illustrating the corrupting influence of commercial priorities. On sacred practices, financial success enables cultural work while potentially compromising cultural integrity. Educational efforts that transmit modified traditional knowledge to diverse students create possibilities for cultural continuity, while also contributing to cultural dilution and transformation. Teaching preserves some traditional elements while inevitably changing them through adaptation to new contexts. Legacy concerns about the long-term effects of your adaptation choices on traditional culture and future practitioners reflect broader anxieties about cultural survival and identity. maintenance that affect indigenous communities throughout the colonial period. Personal decisions contribute to historical patterns whose ultimate significance remains unclear. Your final years as an active chocolate maker are spent in a world that would have been unimaginable when you first began grinding cacao beans in the palace workshops of Tenochtitlan. The chocolate industry you've helped establish has grown beyond your ability to influence or control its development, while the traditional cultural foundations that originally gave meaning to this work have been so thoroughly transformed that they exist primarily in memory and private observance. The workshop where you now spend your days is a bustling commercial operation that produces chocolate for export throughout the Spanish colonial empire and beyond. Young apprentices who have never known traditional methods work with Spanish equipment to create products that bear little resemblance to the sacred beverages you once prepared for imperial ceremonies. The efficiency and productivity would have been impressive to traditional practitioners, but the spiritual emptiness would have been horrifying. Your role has evolved from active production to consultation and quality oversight as your experience and reputation provide value, even when your physical capabilities are diminished by age and the accumulated effects of decades of demanding work. Spanish colonial administrators continue to seek your advice on technical matters while largely ignoring your perspectives on cultural and spiritual aspects of chocolate production. The students you train now include third-generation practitioners who have no direct knowledge of pre-colonial chocolate-making traditions. Teaching them requires adapting traditional knowledge to fit within conceptual frameworks that have been shaped entirely by colonial cultural assumptions. The gap between traditional understanding and contemporary practice continues to widen with each generation. Advanced techniques that once required years of spiritual preparation and cultural education can now be taught as simple mechanical procedures that produce adequate commercial results without deeper understanding. The democratization of technical knowledge increases accessibility while eliminating the spiritual discipline that traditional practitioners considered essential for meaningful work. Quality standards that emphasize consistency and market appeal have largely replaced traditional criteria that focused on spiritual potency and ceremonial appropriateness. Commercial chocolate meets Spanish consumer expectations while failing to achieve the cultural significance that made traditional preparations meaningful to indigenous practitioners. Documentation projects that attempt to record traditional knowledge for historical preservation provide opportunities to reflect on the evolution of chocolate making while raising questions about the value and meaning of cultural knowledge divorced from its original spiritual and social contexts. Academic interest in traditional practices increases as practical relevance diminishes. Health concerns that affect your ability to continue active chocolate making force consideration of retirement, and legacy issues that will determine how your knowledge and experience are preserved or lost. Physical limitations create urgency around cultural transmission activities that have been delayed by immediate survival concerns. Relationships with other aging practitioners who share memories of traditional chocolate making provide emotional support and opportunities for cultural remembrance that become increasingly important as the community of traditional knowledge holders diminishes. Shared experience creates bonds that transcend current circumstances while highlighting cultural losses, economic security achieved through decades of adaptation and commercial success provides resources for cultural preservation activities that weren't possible during earlier periods, focused on immediate survival. Financial stability enables discretionary spending on traditional practices and knowledge transmission projects. Spiritual reflection on the meaning and value of a career spent adapting traditional practices to colonial circumstances raises questions about authenticity, integrity, and cultural responsibility that resist easy answers. Personal evaluation of choices made under extraordinary circumstances requires balancing survival achievements against Cultural costs. Family considerations involving children and grandchildren who represent different levels of connection to traditional culture and colonial. Adaptation create complex inheritance issues affecting both material wealth and cultural knowledge. Generational. Differences reflect broader patterns of cultural change and adaptation. Community relationships with indigenous groups that have maintained more traditional approaches provide perspectives on alternative adaptation strategies while highlighting the isolation that results from cultural compromise. Comparative assessment reveals both benefits and costs of different survival choices. Political awareness of ongoing colonial policies that continue to threaten indigenous cultural survival influences decisions about public versus private cultural expression and preservation. Activities. Contemporary political circumstances affect strategies for maintaining traditional knowledge and practices. Technological innovations that continue to transform chocolate production create new opportunities for efficiency and quality improvement while further distancing contemporary practice from traditional approaches. Technical progress serves commercial interests while potentially eliminating remaining traditional elements. International perspectives on the global chocolate industry that is developed from your early instruction of Spanish students provide insights into the far-reaching consequences of cultural adaptation and knowledge transmission. Global expansion carries modified practices far beyond original cultural contexts. Educational legacy projects that document traditional knowledge and training experiences create resources for future practitioners while raising questions about the relevance and applicability of traditional understanding to radically different contemporary circumstances. Historical documentation preserves knowledge while highlighting cultural discontinuity. Cultural synthesis efforts that attempt to integrate traditional values with contemporary practices create hybrid approaches that honor heritage while adapting to current realities. Synthetic solutions enable some cultural preservation while acknowledging fundamental changes in social and spiritual contexts. Personal satisfaction derived from successful adaptation and cultural preservation, despite extraordinary challenges, provides meaning and validation for choices made during difficult historical circumstances. Individual achievement offers consolation for broader cultural losses, while raising questions about the adequacy of personal solutions to collective problems. As you sit in your workshop during the quiet hours before dawn, grinding cacao beans with movements that have become as natural as breathing, you reflect on the extraordinary journey that has taken you from the sacred spaces of Aztec imperial service to the commercial enterprises of Spanish colonial Mexico. The world around you bears little resemblance to the one where you learned these techniques, yet the fundamental processes of chocolate making provide a thread of continuity that connects past and present. The cacao beans in your hands are descendants of the same plants that provided material for imperial ceremonies, but they've been cultivated using Spanish agricultural methods on plantations worked by enslaved labor rather than free, indigenous farmers following traditional spiritual practices. The genetic continuity masks profound changes in the social and spiritual relationships that once connected chocolate makers to the sources of their materials. The techniques you use combine traditional indigenous methods with Spanish innovations in ways that produce superior commercial results while sacrificing much of the spiritual meaning that once made this work personally fulfilling. Hybrid approaches enable successful adaptation while creating ambiguous relationships to both traditional culture and colonial society. Your students represent multiple generations of practitioners who have learned chocolate making within colonial cultural frameworks that emphasize commercial efficiency over spiritual development. Their competence in technical procedures masks ignorance of traditional cultural contexts that once provided meaning and purpose for these activities. The market for your chocolate extends throughout Spanish colonial territories and into European countries. where consumers appreciate exotic flavors and stimulating properties without understanding the cultural heritage that developed these preparations. Commercial success spreads modified traditional knowledge while eliminating cultural significance. The preservation efforts you've undertaken to maintain traditional knowledge for future generations operate within colonial political and religious constraints that limit the extent to which authentic cultural practices can be transmitted. Cultural preservation activities must balance heritage maintenance against contemporary safety and acceptability requirements. The economic prosperity you've achieved through adaptation to colonial commercial systems provides material security that wouldn't have been possible within traditional Aztec economic structures. But this success has required compromises with traditional values that create ongoing moral tensions. Material advancement comes at cultural costs that resist easy evaluation. Religious practices that combine traditional indigenous observances with Spanish Catholic requirements enable some spiritual continuity while raising questions about authenticity and integrity that affect personal identity and community relationships. Syncretistic spirituality provides meaning while creating theological complexities. Relationships with other cultural adapters who have made similar choices about survival and identity provide mutual support while highlighting the isolation that results from existing between traditional and colonial cultures. Shared experience creates understanding while emphasizing cultural displacement. The documentation you've created to preserve traditional knowledge includes written records that capture technical procedures while potentially missing spiritual and cultural dimensions that resist linguistic translation. Academic preservation efforts maintain some traditional knowledge while possibly losing essential cultural meanings. Family connections that span traditional indigenous heritage and colonial Spanish culture create complex loyalties and identities that reflect broader patterns of cultural mixing throughout colonial Mexico. Personal relationships bridge cultural boundaries while illustrating ongoing cultural transformation. Professional reputation within colonial commercial systems provides status and influence that enable some cultural preservation activities, while also representing participation in systems that have displaced traditional culture. Commercial success creates opportunities while potentially compromising cultural integrity. International awareness of the global chocolate industry that has developed from traditional Mexican practices provides perspective on the far-reaching consequences of cultural adaptation and knowledge transmission. Global expansion carries modified practices beyond their original cultural contexts while creating new opportunities for cultural expression. Educational legacy involving the transmission of hybrid knowledge to diverse students creates possibilities for cultural continuity while contributing to ongoing cultural transformation. Teaching activities preserve some traditional elements, while inevitably changing them through adaptation to contemporary circumstances. Spiritual legacy involving the maintenance of traditional religious observances within colonial religious frameworks preserves some cultural heritage while adapting it to fundamentally different theological and social contexts. Religious continuity enables cultural preservation while requiring significant modification of traditional practices. Community relationships with indigenous groups that have maintained more traditional approaches provide connections to authentic cultural heritage, while highlighting the extent to which adaptation choices have created distance from traditional culture. Comparative perspectives reveal both benefits and costs of different survival strategies. Historical perspective on the transformation of chocolate from sacred indigenous beverage to global commercial commodity provides insights into broader patterns of cultural change and adaptation that affect indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. Personal experience illuminates historical processes while raising questions about cultural survival and identity maintenance. Personal satisfaction derived from successful navigation of extraordinary historical circumstances provides meaning and validation while raising questions about the adequacy of individual solutions to collective cultural challenges. Individual achievement offers consolation while highlighting broader cultural losses. Your hands move with practiced precision as you prepare what may be your final batch of traditional chocolate, working by candlelight in the pre-dawn hours when the world is quiet enough to hear the whispers of ancient knowledge that still echo in your memory. This morning's preparation combines techniques learned in the palace of Moctezuma with innovations developed during decades of colonial adaptation, creating a synthesis that honors the past while acknowledging the present. The cacao beans you select represent the finest quality available within current commercial systems, though they lack the spiritual preparation and blessing that once transformed mere agricultural products into sacred substances. You hold each bean briefly, offering silent prayers to cacao, while acknowledging that the goddess herself has had to adapt to changed circumstances. Your grinding technique incorporates traditional rhythms and pressures that create optimal texture while accommodating modern time constraints and commercial requirements. The meditative aspects of repetitive motion continue to provide spiritual benefits despite the secular context within which you now work. The spice blend you create combines traditional indigenous ingredients with Spanish additions that enhance flavor appeal for colonial markets while maintaining some connection to ancestral recipes. Chili peppers provide heat that recalls warrior chocolate, while cinnamon offers warmth that appeals to European palates. The foaming technique that creates the crown presentation, traditional in Aztec culture, requires modifications to work with sweetened preparations that Spanish consumers prefer, but the essential skill and spiritual intention remain unchanged. Technical adaptation preserves cultural elements within contemporary constraints. As you work, you recite traditional prayers and incantations in the ancient language, knowing that the words carry power regardless of whether others understand their meaning. Spiritual practice continues even when its context has been fundamentally altered by historical circumstances. The finished chocolate represents generations of accumulated knowledge that has survived conquest, colonization, and cultural transformation. Through adaptation and preservation efforts that balanced heritage maintenance against survival necessities, each cup contains centuries of indigenous wisdom modified for contemporary circumstances. Students who observe your work see technical procedures that produce superior commercial results, while missing the spiritual dimensions and cultural significance that continue to provide personal meaning despite changed circumstances. Cultural transmission occurs at multiple levels simultaneously. The sharing of this chocolate with colleagues and students creates opportunities for cultural education that operates within acceptable colonial frameworks while preserving essential traditional elements. Teaching moments arise naturally through demonstration of excellence and explanation of techniques. Written documentation of this final recipe attempts to capture not just technical procedures, but some of the cultural context and spiritual significance that traditional practices carried. Academic preservation efforts maintain knowledge, while raising questions about the adequacy of linguistic records for cultural transmission. Family members who receive portions of this chocolate participate in cultural continuity activities that connect them to ancestral heritage while adapting to contemporary circumstances. Domestic cultural preservation occurs through ordinary activities that maintain traditional connections. The economic value of chocolate produced using traditional expertise continues to provide resources for cultural preservation activities, while demonstrating the ongoing relevance of indigenous knowledge within colonial commercial systems. Cultural capital translates into economic benefits that enable further preservation efforts. International distribution of chocolate produced using traditional techniques carries modified indigenous knowledge throughout global markets while creating opportunities for cultural expression and education in distant locations. Cultural diffusion spreads heritage while transforming it through new contexts. Religious observances that accompany chocolate preparation maintain spiritual connections to traditional practices while adapting to colonial. Religious requirements that limit direct expression of indigenous spirituality. Syncretistic practice preserves essential elements while modifying their expression. Community relationships with other indigenous practitioners who maintain traditional approaches in various forms provide networks for cultural preservation and mutual support that transcend individual circumstances. Collective efforts create possibilities for heritage maintenance that individual actions couldn't achieve. Historical awareness of the transformation that chocolate has undergone from sacred indigenous beverage to global commercial commodity provides perspective on broader patterns of cultural change while highlighting both losses and adaptations that characterize colonial experience. Personal experience illuminates historical processes. Educational legacy, involving the transmission of hybrid knowledge that combines traditional expertise with contemporary requirements, creates possibilities for cultural continuity, while acknowledging fundamental changes in social and spiritual contexts. Teaching preserves heritage while adapting it for current circumstances. Professional legacy, involving the establishment of commercial chocolate production that incorporates traditional knowledge, creates economic opportunities for indigenous practitioners while contributing to cultural transformation. Economic development serves both heritage preservation and contemporary survival needs. Personal satisfaction derived from successful preservation of traditional knowledge, despite extraordinary challenges, provides meaning and validation for choices made during difficult historical circumstances. Individual achievement offers consolation, while raising questions about collective cultural survival. Cultural synthesis that integrates traditional values with contemporary requirements creates hybrid approaches that honor heritage while enabling adaptation to radically changed circumstances. Synthetic solutions preserve some traditional elements while acknowledging fundamental historical transformations. Spiritual legacy involving the maintenance of traditional religious and cultural practices within colonial frameworks preserves essential heritage while adapting it to contemporary political and social constraints. Cultural preservation occurs through modification rather than orthodox maintenance. As the chocolate cools to serving temperature, you reflect on the long journey that has brought you from palace service to colonial adaptation, recognizing that your personal experience represents broader patterns of survival and transformation that characterize indigenous responses to European colonization throughout the Americas. The cup you lift to your lips contains not just chocolate, but the distilled essence of cultural adaptation, spiritual resilience, and the eternal human capacity to find meaning and maintain identity despite circumstances that seem designed to destroy both. In this final taste, you honor the ancestors who developed these techniques, the students who will carry them forward, and the goddess Cacao, who continues to bless those who work with her sacred beans. Despite all the changes that have transformed her worship, the bitter complexity that fills your mouth carries flavors that span centuries and cultures. The ancient wisdom of cacao preparation techniques that predate written history. The innovations born from necessity during periods of cultural crisis. And the hope that essential knowledge will survive even as its context continues to evolve. Each note on your palate tells a story of survival, adaptation, and the determination to preserve what can be saved from the wreckage of civilizations. As you swallow the last of the chocolate, you feel the familiar warmth spreading through your body, carrying with it not just physical nourishment, but spiritual connection to traditions that have been bent but not broken by historical forces beyond your control. The goddess may speak more quietly now, her voice muffled by Spanish prayers and commercial considerations, but she continues to offer guidance to those who know how to listen. The morning light begins to filter through your workshop windows, illuminating tools that bridge ancient and modern worlds, ingredients that connect sacred and commercial purposes, and knowledge that spans traditional wisdom and contemporary innovation. The work continues, as it has for generations, and as it will for generations to come, adapting to new circumstances while maintaining essential connections to the cultural heritage that gives it meaning. Your legacy lives not just in the written records you've created or the students you've trained, but in every cup of chocolate that carries forward some fragment of traditional knowledge into an uncertain future. The goddess Ixcacao smiles as she watches her children continue the ancient work of transforming simple beings into something that nourishes both body and soul, regardless of the political systems or commercial frameworks within which they must operate. The screaming that once echoed through the corridors of power has been replaced by the quiet sounds of morning commerce. But the sacred work continues. In workshops and kitchens throughout the colonial world, practitioners who learned from you or from those you taught continue the endless cycle of roasting, grinding, and mixing that connects the human and divine realms through the medium of chocolate. And as you prepare for another day of work that bridges traditional wisdom and contemporary requirements, you carry with you the knowledge that culture is not a fixed thing to be preserved unchanged, but a living force that adapts and evolves while maintaining its essential spirit. The chocolate maker's art survives not because it has remained the same, but because it has found ways to change while preserving what matters most. The goddess Ixcacao lives on in every properly prepared cup of chocolate, her presence undiminished. By conquest or colonization, her wisdom still available to those who approach cacao with the respect and attention it deserves. And in this continuity, despite all the disruption and transformation, there is hope that the essential knowledge will survive to nourish future generations who may understand its value, even if they cannot fully comprehend its origins. The eternal recipe is not written in any book or carved in any stone. It lives in the hands that know how to work with cacao, in the hearts that understand the sacred nature of the bean, and in the spirits that recognize chocolate not as mere food but as a bridge between the earthly and divine realms. This knowledge cannot be destroyed by political conquest or commercial exploitation. It can only be forgotten. And forgetting is a choice that each generation must make for itself. As long as there are those who remember that chocolate is more than a commodity, who approach its preparation with reverence and attention, who understand that the goddess Ixcacao continues to bless those who honor her gifts, the true art of chocolate making will survive. It may be practiced in different contexts, adapted to new circumstances, expressed through modified techniques, but its essential spirit will endure. The morning work begins again, as it has for countless mornings before, and will for countless mornings to come. The beans must be selected, roasted, ground, and transformed through ancient alchemy into the sacred beverage that connects earth to heaven, past to future, tradition to innovation. The goddess awaits, patient and eternal, ready to bless those who approach her realm with proper respect and dedication. In this continuity, despite all change and disruption, lies the true victory of traditional knowledge over historical forces that sought to destroy it. The chocolate maker's art endures because it serves not just commercial purposes, but human needs that transcend political and economic systems. As long as people seek connection to something greater than themselves, the sacred art of chocolate making will find ways to survive and flourish. The story ends where it began, with hands working cacao beans, with prayers offered to ancient goddesses, with the eternal transformation of simple ingredients into something that nourishes both body and soul. The circumstances may change. The practitioners may adapt their methods. The context may evolve, but the essential work continues, carrying forward the wisdom of ages into whatever future awaits. And in this continuity, in this persistence of sacred work, despite all obstacles, lies hope for all traditional knowledge. and cultural heritage facing similar challenges. What matters most cannot be destroyed by external forces. It can only be abandoned by those who are meant to carry it forward. As long as the work continues, the tradition lives, adapting and evolving while maintaining its essential spirit for generations yet to come. Trusted relationships with other practitioners become crucial for coordinating preservation efforts that might succeed where individual actions would fail. Collaborative strategies for knowledge preservation require careful communication and mutual support despite the surveillance and suspicion that characterize life under military occupation. The spiritual preparation for leaving your workshop involves ceremonies that honor the goddess Ixcacao while requesting her continued protection. For traditional chocolate making practices, these private rituals must be conducted with extreme discretion to avoid attracting Spanish attention while providing the spiritual closure necessary for psychological transition. The destruction of traditional institutional structures eliminates the formal apprenticeship systems that have transmitted chocolate-making knowledge for generations. Alternative education approaches must be developed that can function within colonial social and economic constraints while preserving essential technical and cultural information. Personal safety considerations require careful evaluation of different survival strategies and their likely outcomes under various colonial policy scenarios. Collaboration with Spanish authorities offers potential protection, but requires compromising traditional values and practices. Resistance or withdrawal risks persecution, but might preserve cultural integrity. The negotiation process with Spanish administrators who are interested in chocolate production. Expertise involves demonstrating value while withholding sensitive information that could be misused. Commercial chocolate making for export markets might provide sustainable income, while requiring significant modifications to traditional preparation methods. Equipment preservation requires selecting tools and vessels that can be transported or hidden while maintaining capability for chocolate preparation under different circumstances. Traditional grinding stones are too heavy for easy transport but essential for proper texture development. Ceremonial vessels might preserve spiritual significance but attract unwanted attention. The psychological preparation for cultural transition involves accepting that the world of traditional chocolate making is ending while maintaining hope that essential elements might survive in modified forms. Grief for the loss of familiar structures must be balanced against determination to preserve what remains possible. Documentation decisions require choosing what knowledge to record in writing, what to preserve through oral tradition, and what might be safely shared with Spanish students or administrators. Different types of information require different preservation strategies based on their sensitivity and potential for misuse. Family considerations affect preservation strategies, as responsibilities to children and relatives must be balanced against professional commitments to cultural preservation. Personal survival and family welfare might conflict with obligations to maintain traditional practices and knowledge. The final preparations also involve practical arrangements for transportation, temporary shelter, and basic survival needs during the period of transition from palace employment to whatever new life circumstances emerge under colonial rule. Emergency supplies and escape routes might become necessary if collaboration with Spanish authorities proves impossible or dangerous. 6 months after the fall of Tenochtitlan, you find yourself in the unprecedented position of serving as chocolate instructor to Spanish colonists who are attempting to establish commercial chocolate production for export to European markets. The irony is not lost on you. The same people who destroyed your civilization now depend on your expertise to profit from one of its greatest cultural achievements. Your new workshop is located in the Spanish sector of what was once Tenochtitlan, now being rebuilt according to European urban planning principles that prioritize commercial efficiency over the spiritual and ceremonial considerations that guided traditional Aztec architecture. The space is larger than your palace workshop, but lacks the sacred atmosphere that once made chocolate preparation a form of divine communion. The Spanish students you're training approach chocolate making with attitudes that continue to conflict with traditional values despite your efforts. To communicate the spiritual significance of proper cacao handling, they focus on technical procedures while showing little interest in the cultural context that gives those procedures their deeper meaning. Their questions emphasize productivity and profit margins, rather than spiritual purity and ceremonial effectiveness. Don Carlos Mendoza, the Spanish colonial administrator who oversees your new position, treats you with a mixture of respect for your expertise and condescension for your indigenous heritage that reflects broader colonial attitudes toward native knowledge and practitioners. He values your technical skills while dismissing your cultural perspectives as primitive superstitions that interfere with efficient commercial operations. The working conditions under Spanish supervision involve compromises that would have been unthinkable during your palace service. Cost reduction pressures require using inferior ingredients and simplified preparation. Techniques that produce adequate commercial products while sacrificing the quality and spiritual potency that characterize traditional imperial chocolate. Your Spanish students include both colonists seeking profitable business opportunities and indigenous apprentices who are learning modified techniques that might provide employment under colonial economic systems. Teaching these mixed classes requires developing instructional methods that bridge cultural gaps while preserving essential technical knowledge. The commercial chocolate production that you're supervising emphasizes quantity and consistency over the individualized attention and spiritual preparation that characterize traditional practice. Standardized recipes and mechanical grinding equipment increase efficiency while eliminating the meditative and ceremonial aspects that once made chocolate making a form of spiritual discipline. Export market requirements drive product development. Efforts that focus on creating chocolate preparations that can survive ocean voyages to European markets, while appealing to foreign palates that prefer sweetness over traditional complexity. These modifications require ongoing experimentation with preservation techniques and flavor profiles that maintain commercial viability. The Spanish colonial government regulates chocolate production through taxation and licensing systems that treat traditional sacred practices as ordinary commercial activities subject to bureaucratic oversight and revenue generation. Religious protocols that once governed preparation are replaced by administrative procedures that prioritize documentation and compliance over spiritual effectiveness. Relationships with surviving indigenous practitioners who maintain traditional approaches in remote communities provide opportunities for knowledge exchange and cultural preservation despite colonial restrictions on traditional religious activities. These underground networks operate discreetly to preserve essential spiritual and technical knowledge while avoiding persecution. The economic success of your Spanish colonial chocolate operation creates opportunities for expansion and innovation while raising concerns about the commercialization of sacred practices that were once restricted to ceremonial and religious contexts. Profit-driven production methods conflict with traditional values while providing practical benefits for survival under colonial rule. Personal adaptation to Spanish colonial society requires learning new social protocols and cultural expectations while maintaining indigenous identity and values to the extent possible within colonial constraints. Code switching between Spanish professional context and indigenous cultural preservation activities becomes a daily survival strategy. The documentation requirements imposed by Spanish colonial administration create written records of chocolate, making techniques that preserve technical knowledge while potentially exposing sensitive information to unauthorized users. Balancing transparency requirements against cultural protection needs requires careful judgment about what information to reveal or conceal. Religious syncretism that combines Christian observances with indigenous spiritual practices allows for some preservation of traditional chocolate ceremonies within acceptable colonial religious frameworks. Private observance of traditional protocols provides spiritual continuity, while avoiding persecution for practicing prohibited indigenous religions. The training of indigenous assistants who can maintain traditional technical standards while adapting to colonial working conditions ensures some preservation of quality and cultural knowledge within modified commercial contexts. These apprentices represent hope for cultural continuity despite fundamental changes in social and economic structures. Quality control challenges emerge as commercial pressures conflict with traditional standards for ingredient selection and preparation techniques. Maintaining product quality while meeting cost and efficiency requirements requires innovative approaches that balance commercial viability against cultural and technical integrity